Thank you. We will resume from the lunch break. I now call on representatives from the Australian Federal Police and the Department of Home Affairs to give evidence. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Alexander Goldie, Assistant Secretary for Countering Violent Extremism.
Brendan Dowling, Counter-Terrorism Coordinator, Department of Home Affairs.
Simon Walsh, National Manager, Strategy and Performance.
Brooke Everett, National Manager, People, AFP.
Peter Crozier, Assistant Commissioner, Counter-Terrorism Command.
Chris Goldsmead, Acting Assistant Commissioner, Learning and Development.
Thank you very much. We might... do either of you have an opening statement that you want to make?
Yes, we do, if that's okay,
yes,
Chair.
Please.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I want to acknowledge something from the outset. For many First Nations people, watching a police agency speak to an inquiry about racism, hate and violence is not a neutral experience. Policing in this country carries a long history, and the relationship between police and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is for many marked by harm as much as by protection. We do not come to this table asking the committee or the communities listening to set that history aside. I want to be precise about where the AFP fits, because overstating our role would not serve the committee. Most day-to-day policing, including most reports of racially motivated assault, harassment or crime, falls to state and territory police, not the AFP. Our remit, as linked to the terms of reference of this committee, is Commonwealth crimes, countering terrorism and ideologically motivated violent extremism, including racially motivated extremism and investigating serious online offending. Additionally, ACT police are part of the AFP, and matters relating to ACT policing functions are subject to scrutiny and oversight by the ACT government through the ACT Legislative Assembly. The events that prompted this inquiry are serious, and the AFP and our security and law enforcement partners will use all our powers, capabilities and resources to ensure hate and violence are not used as weapons to silence communities. On the 4th of February 2026, the Western Australia Joint Counter-Terrorism Team charged a 31-year-old man with one count of engaging in a terrorist act. It is alleged the man removed a homemade improvised explosive device from his bag and threw it at a rally held in support of First Nations people in Perth's Central Business District on the 26th of January 2026. The offence carries a maximum penalty of life imprisonment and was the first time that offence was used in Western Australia. Additionally, since 2020, 29% of the individuals charged by the AFP in counter-terrorism operations have been motivated by ideological violent extremism. The AFP has witnessed racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism form part of the national threat picture, and a meaningful share of the minors and young adults entering our CT investigations are being radicalised online into nationalist and racist ideologies. This is further evidenced by the Australian Government listing of the White Australia Party as a prohibited hate group in May 2026. The AFP will continue to disrupt and investigate those who endanger our social cohesion by promoting hate and violence, whether in person or online. In doing so, the AFP works closely with the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions to identify the charges most appropriately supported by the available evidence. Internally, we have continued investment in First Nations recruitment, where we are aiming to increase the percentage of First Nations employees to 3% by 2028. Additionally, we are implementing further cultural capability training. The AFP is in the final stages of preparing our first Stretch Reconciliation Action Plan, or RAP, working closely with Reconciliation Australia. The Stretch RAP is built on the pillars of relationships, respect and opportunities. In practical terms, the Stretch RAP strengthens the pathway for the AFP to be an agency where First Nations people's rights, histories and culture are respected and integrated into our core operations. Some of the key ways this is being actioned is through including First Nations voices as part of the AFP decision making, further relationships and partnerships supporting reconciliation, engaging employees in continuous cultural learning opportunities to increase understanding and appreciation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, histories and achievements, and also expanding entry pathways for First Nations applicants. The AFP is also continuing partnerships with New South Wales Police and the New South Wales TAFE to expand the Indigenous Police Recruitment Our Way Delivery, or iProud, program to include the AFP as a pathway option for iProud graduates. Cultural training and engagement programs are necessary, but they are not on their own evidence that trust can be rebuilt with First Nations communities. We are conscious this committee and Parliament has considered issues of racial profiling and the over-representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, including children, in the justice system. As I've outlined earlier, much of that lies beyond the AFP's direct jurisdiction, but it shapes our broader actions and considerations on First Nations issues. We do not raise our federal remit to step around it. The AFP is one agency with a specific role operating inside an issue that is older and bigger than policing and that will not be solved by policing alone. What we can offer is candour about what we do and a genuine willingness to do more to address these issues that you have before you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. And you indicated Home Affairs doesn't have an opening statement.
Correct.
We'll proceed to questions and, of course, be mindful of the current legal proceedings that are underway in our questions as well.
Thank you.
Senator Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for appearing today. I've asked everyone this question, so I just want to be really clear. How does the AFP contribute to systemic racism?
Well, Senator, thank you for your question. I don't believe that the AFP is a contributor to systemic racism.
Okay, so is there any systemic racism within the AFP or Home Affairs?
I didn't say there was not systemic racism. I took your question to mean, or to ask, whether we were a positive contributor, as in making the problem of systemic racism worse. I don't believe that we are.
Okay. And is there systemic racism within the AFP and Home Affairs?
I don't believe the AFP is systemically racist, but I do obviously acknowledge that as with many other organisations and many other parts of society, we're not free of racism and not free of some of the challenges that it may present.
Home Affairs?
I think from the Home Affairs perspective, we would have a similar view to the AFP in that we are acutely conscious that there is prejudice, racism that displays in the department. We're a department of 16,000 people. We have strong involvement with and connection to First Nations communities. So for us, it is a priority to not pretend that those issues aren't real and may manifest, but to have active programs that look to educate, improve cultural awareness, have a zero tolerance approach to any racism that is witnessed in the department or its program. So it's a very serious responsibility we take to address any form of racism that we see.
So just to be clear, okay, that's fine. So what, okay, let's go to hate and terrorism. A number of submissions pointed to the pattern of hesitancy from authorities to treat attacks against First Peoples as serious compared to responses to attacks against other groups. We've seen the racial motivation behind crimes against us downplayed. The neo-Nazi attack on Camp Sovereignty is an example And so is the response to the Ballou bombing. It took a lot of agitating and calling out for that to be, taken more seriously. In your view, why is there strong agreement in many submissions to this inquiry that police and authorities are treating our lives as lesser than?
I might ask Assistant Commissioner Crozier to answer from
Thank
the
you for your
operational
question,
perspective.
Senator. I think it's important to note, certainly as far as the camp sovereignty investigation, that is a Victorian investigation, Victorian police investigation, which is I've got to be mindful that the matters are before court. But can I say this? In my experience, an investigation where you've got 15 people arrested and charged for a location which is obviously an incredibly important cultural site, but the crime, as a process crime scene, it was done very sensitively and very effectively. To be able to, as I say, get 15 people before the court, in my experience, is a really significant commitment and undertaking. And importantly, the charges that were brought against the individuals reflect the sort of, the offending that Victoria Police allege has been undertaken. Now, again, I need to be really mindful that that matter is before the court, and it's not one that the AFP certainly have very strong relationships with Victoria Police and are in partnership across a range of crime types. But in that regard, as I say, in my experience, that was a significant commitment and a significant result to get it to court where it is now. In respect to the matter in Western Australia, that response, again, was a Western Australian Police response supported by the AFP. But the charges that have been laid, in particular a terrorism charge, I think, again, reflects the seriousness of the offending and the fact that one of the concerns that we certainly have in relation to that matter is that it's an individual that has, undertaken some of the worst offending which is available against our statute. And, we need to be very mindful about making sure that the charges that we lay are appropriate and supported by evidence. Now, as a result of what actually occurred, it does take time to make sure we can get the evidence that's available to reach that level for a terrorist-related charge.
Lucky the bomb didn't go off. The Vic poll could have laid Commonwealth charges. To have 14 or whatever it was Nazis who are clearly part of a Nazi group that you all know about, for that not to be seen to be a hate crime, it just begs the question, and that's what people are asking.
Senator, I am aware that you've put a number of questions on notice to us and the AFP has responded to those. But I think it's also important to note that in terms of the hate crimes, that is where there's threats or threats of violence or threats of force, whereas this has actually occurred where people have been assaulted. And it's not the threat of that violence, it's not the threat of that, it's actually those offences have been committed and those people have been charged with things such as affray, assault, disorder. So they are very significant charges in the Victorian statute.
So when you say there were no threats?
Sorry?
No threats?
I'm certainly not saying there were no threats. I'm saying that within the hate crime legislation you are talking about the threat or someone trying to urge or coerce a person to whereas these actual offences have occurred of assault and disorder and the like. So that's actually occurred. That's why they've been charged with that statute, that it's not we're threatening you or asking a person or urging a person. This has actually occurred.
But it's not a hate crime. A bunch of Nazis rushing into a blackfella sacred place and assaulting, breaking people's noses, and that's like a bunch of Nazis in black with weapons walking through the city where everyone could see.
I would say, Senator, as you know, subsequent to that, we have listed the White Australia Party under the hate crimes legislation as a prohibited hate group, and those activities which we are describing are not the sole reason, but certainly form part of the reasoning why that listing as a prohibited hate group did occur.
So if it happened today, would they be charged with a hate crime now that they're known as a hate group?
So under the hate crime legislation, they are prohibited from operating as a group. They're prohibited from engaging in that promotion of racial hatred. So if that group was to organise to conduct that type of activity, they would likely be in breach of the listing that has occurred under that legislation.
Thank you.
Sorry, could I just add, Senator, with that again, it's the hate crime itself. If we were undertaking it in the lead up, and we were aware that there was commentary made, if it was online or whatever it was, we would be, and people were urging or seeking to urge people to use force or violence, then we would be looking at a matter as a hate crime. But as I say, as you note, and you noted that these individuals went into a sacred location. They assaulted people at that location. They caused disorder. They actually went through with those offences, and that's what they've been charged with. Yeah. Now, if we were in a situation somewhat differently, but across different jurisdictions, there might be slight differences. But the reality is, the offence, to our mind, from an alleged perspective, has been completed, and that's why they've been charged with those offences.
So, if you had evidence of online threats before that, leading up to that event, would that
could potentially be a charge that we were considering? I mean, one of our key actions that we want to put in place is to make sure these things don't occur. So looking for preventative activity wherever we can. And if we can disrupt things online, or if we can get the information or the evidence offline to then be able to take an overt activity to disrupt that, that's absolutely our preference.
Thank you. Both AFP and ASIO have said in submissions that nationalist and racist violent extremism is a growing threat, and that First Peoples are increasingly being used as rallying points for extremist groups. Can you point to a single example, other than the Ballou bombing, where anti-Aboriginal threats resulted in Commonwealth charges?
Senator, the point that I make, and I'm very mindful of the Director General's threat assessment that he spoke to on Wednesday, that the environment that we're working in is definitely degraded, and there is a lot more, just the lack of respect in terms of engagement and a dialogue. It's people's just taking away their right to have a respectful dialogue. That's occurring. We know that. In this regard. And importantly, I'll go back to the matter in Western Australia. We are very mindful that is an individual who was acting alone, as we understand at this point of time. The person has used a range of ways to be radicalised, including some online material. Again, I need to be really careful about what I say here, Senator, because it is before court. But what we want to make sure through a matter such as this is that the lines of communication between community and law enforcement and other agencies for reporting remain open. And that includes, in any case, the responsibility to continue to build trust. Because, primarily the way that we will find out about issues and threats are the work that we might do online, but are also coming from community. We know that across all law enforcement. So how we go about that and how we make sure that occurs and that the community have trust to come forward is really important. But in terms of these other matters, I would have to take on notice any matters we've had in relation to First Nations threats. But there is also, I put this broadly, some matters where the venom and the rhetoric that people are espousing online covers a whole range of different groups. So some of it may not necessarily be absolutely specific, but if you wouldn't mind, I will take that point, that on notice.
Thank you. The AIC database shows 47 hate charges laid last year under Commonwealth legislation. Happy for you to take this on notice. How many have been laid this year since then? And of all of these, how many were for hate crimes against First Peoples?
Sorry, I didn't catch the first part of your question, Senator.
So there's a AIC
Yes.
database that shows that there's 47 hate charges laid last year under Commonwealth legislation. How many have been laid this year? And of those, how many were for hate crimes against First People?
Okay, I will take the last one on notice, but what I will say is across, as at the 3rd of June, from a CT operations perspective, we've had 21 individuals who have been charged across 16 counter-terrorism offences. Now, that's not necessarily hate crime matters, and I will get to the matters around them and the like, but I think one of the concerning points that I'd like to put on notice is the prevalence of youth in some of our matters, and including the prevalence of youth in violent extremist material matters. That is obviously something that we're very focused on. How do we engage? How do we ensure that we can create pathways people away from that sort of behaviour? And you know the fact that the number of youth in that, and it is, and some of the material they're looking at is absolutely appalling. And it doesn't all go well that if they're looking at that and they're becoming desensitised to that, you know, what that might then lead to is significantly concerning to us.
Thank you. And again, on notice, if you can provide a breakdown of the group's category against which these charges were laid. How many active investigations are underway in relation to Commonwealth offences against First Peoples?
Senator, if you would, I'll take that on notice as well.
If extremists see First Peoples as a target and a mobilisation tool, why don't we see a corresponding number of hate crime prosecutions, terror investigations or disruption operations focused on extremism against First Peoples?
Well, it will depend, I suppose, very much on what's being reported to us. We will obviously, and as I say, I'm very mindful that on a number of these matters, especially the online space, we will get people that are you know that might be espousing rhetoric across a range of different groups, and you know, particularly we've had a significant number against the Jewish community since 2023, and then further parts to 2025. But I would take on notice in relation to those other matters. But yeah, there are very much incidents where individuals are throwing their disgraceful rhetoric across a range of different platforms.
Yep, and I know it. Is there a gap between the threat level and enforcement and follow-up? Are our lives being treated as less important than the lives of other groups? And if so, is that the latest example of racist policing?
Senator, I could say that probably the most important commitment you make as a police officer is to apply the law without fear or favour from the time you commence in policing. So, you know, it's the focus will always be about, as much as we can, preventing crime and ensuring people don't have to go through or experience the trauma of being exposed to crime. So it's difficult for me to say anything further about other than that. But we don't categorise crime by race.
I would add, Senator, you cited the increasing numbers of cases, people that we're worried about who are engaging in white supremacists, extreme nationalists, targeting First Nations communities. We are seeing in the programs that Home Affairs supports nationally at the preventative end, what we will call countering violent extremism programs where people are identified as having engaged in that type of content well before they get to the point that the federal police might be engaging in a criminal investigation. We do see increasing numbers of people engaging in that material who are referred into those programs. It's not a silver bullet by any means to address the racism and extremism that we see increasing across the country, but we are pivoting more of our effort and our work with the states and territories in those programs to address the increase in extremism targeted at First Nations communities. At this stage, we don't have granular reporting of the people who are engaged in those programs who are looking at or who hold extremist views about First Nations communities, but that will be a feature of our data reporting in future. So Mr. Goldie might like to add to that in terms of our programs, but it is an increasing focus of our efforts in the countering violent extremism work.
Senator, we have now approximately, at our last reporting period, about 292 individuals across the country who are active participants in countering violent extremism programs, which are delivered by states and territories. About 30% of that group is ideologically motivated violent extremists. So that includes a number of different subtypes of ideology, but the one that we're most focused on in this context is the nationalist and racist violent extremists, which number about 62. One of the complicating factors is that we're seeing, particularly in the preventative end, a larger cohort of individuals with very mixed, unclear and unstable ideologies, in addition to those fuller, more identifiable, discrete ideologies, if you like. So a number of people can have a very narrow grievance against a particular group, be it a particular community group or against women, for example, and that makes it hard to sort of categorise them amongst a broader group. As Mr. Dowling said, we collect a lot of information about the kinds of things which motivate people so that we can better target and tailor our programs to support people, which are all really about taking people from a really dark path, providing them supports and getting them back into leading full and normal lives. But one of the things I'd say is that academic research on violent extremist targeting of First Nations people in Australia is severely lacking. I know Dr. Shandon Harris-Hogan has made a submission to this inquiry, and Dr. Harris-Hogan's work, and in particular 2 research pieces, are basically the full field of research at the moment in Australia on that very specific angle. We're looking very closely at that work, but also looking to support more academics engaging in this particular field of inquiry so that we can look at whether our programs are doing the absolute best that they can be in addressing the current threat environment.
Thank you. How many First Nations people, First Peoples, are employed in counter-terrorism and national security investigations units?
In the Department of Home Affairs, I'd have to take on notice. I don't know off the top of my head in those roles and across national security group what the numbers are.
Yeah, we'd probably have to take that on notice too, Senator. We have overall workforce rates of about 2.7% across the AFP as a whole. But in terms of exactly what number or proportion of those are in the areas of investigations that you've mentioned, we'd have to take that on notice.
Thank you.
We do in our sorry, Senator. We do in our any of the programs and work that Mr. Goldie described. We do engage with representatives of First Nations communities in the policy development process. We have a youth advisory council on our countering violent extremism work, which has First Nations representation. So we do try to ensure that those perspectives from the side of victims of these types of hateful or extreme activity are represented in the work.
Thank you. In November last year, AFP officers pulled a gun on an Aboriginal teenager on a Canberra bus who was the wrong suspect. The police still searched this child even after they realised he was the wrong person. You've got an internal investigation underway. It has been months and we've heard nothing. Is this more cops investigating cops? And do you acknowledge that this completely undermines First Peoples' trust and that it creates a sense that police operate with impunity?
Obviously, as referenced in the opening statement today, Senator, the ACT policing arm of the AFP is subject to oversight by the ACT government and the ACT Legislative Assembly. So we don't have that representation here for those reasons. With respect to the incident you mentioned, obviously it was a serious incident and responded to as such. As you mentioned, the AFP, through its Professional Standards Command, is undertaking an internal investigation, but also the Office of the Commonwealth Ombudsman launched an own motion investigation. Both of those investigations are still ongoing, so we aren't able to speak further about those until such time they're concluded. But the internal investigation would need to be mindful of the own motion investigation by the Commonwealth Ombudsman and need to make sure that they were fully cooperating with that investigation and aligning things such as the timeframes and the progress of their work to fit well and to complement the work undertaken by the Ombudsman themselves.
Does the AFP collect data about whether Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are disproportionately subjected to searches and use of force?
Once again, Senator, those sorts of activities would predominantly occur in a community policing environment. So under the work of our ACT policing or work in our external territories potentially, we don't have that data here for that purpose.
So you don't collect the data as AFP?
I actually would not even able to say that we do or we don't. I think that in those areas of policing, as you know, there's mandated data collection and reporting responsibilities, and obviously organisations, collect a range of data also for other purposes, including for integrity purposes. So I'm happy to take that on notice and see if there's anything we can provide for you against that particular question.
Just checking in, Senator Thorpe.
I've got a lot of questions. It's the AFP, Home Affairs, come on.
I thought you
But
might.
happy to pass.
Yeah, okay, I might share the comment. Probably
Yeah,
we'll have time
sure.
to come back to you. Mr Venning.
Thank you, Jay. Just in terms of clarifying some legal thresholds, how does the AFP distinguish between offensive but lawful speech and conduct that crosses the line into criminal hate speech or terrorism offences?
So, Senator, within the hate speech legislation itself, it's where you've got elements where people are urging violence or threat, the use of violence or force to urge a people to commit an act. So that's, but then you've got, we need to be in a position where people are knowing they can exercise their right, their democratic right. But when it goes into that criminal space, then we will look to take whatever action we need to.
Has the AFP observed an increase in ideologically motivated threats targeting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, particularly online?
I'd probably have to take that on notice as far as that data, but we certainly have. We've certainly seen an increase in people online, and using threatening or it's absolutely abhorrent sort of communication. Yeah.
Yep. I understand that you're the AFP, and a lot of the policing in our remote communities is done by your state counterparts, and your submission refers to collaboration with state police. Are there gaps in data collection or legislative consistency that impede a coordinated national response to these crimes?
I would probably have to take that on notice, sir. We obviously collect the data around the investigations that we're undertaking. Across a range of our jurisdictions, we have our joint counter-terrorism teams. We work closely through our national security investigations teams with the equivalents in each of the states and territories. But I would have to take on notice how we collect that, or how that data is actually reflected across both of our respective agencies.
So there is a proposal for the National Hate Crime Database. And how do you think this will improve the reporting and investigations involving offences against First Nations people?
Sorry, Senator, sir, you are right. We are a participant to contributing to that database. I'm not sure of whether we break it, how the categories are broken down in terms of reflecting on that, but I can come back to the committee with advice on whether it goes to we categorise First Nations people.
Yeah, okay. Now, this is not meant to be a contentious question. I trust what the AFP does. I think you do a great job. Does the AFP need more powers in and around these issues, and specifically into our inquiry and the issues that we're trying to assess?
I think we haven't got any active submissions. Obviously, the legislative reform and policy reform is a matter for government. We engage, particularly through our policy department, regularly and routinely on issues that come forward from our operating environment. There's a range of circumstances, therefore, always where we're actually in those sorts of negotiations and discussions. But when it comes to your question, I might just go back, Mr. Venning, to your question around states and territories, if I may. In my experience, there is always some level of inconsistency with respect to how, in the detail of legislation, different activities and different offences are described. In practical terms, in partnership, those things are regularly and routinely worked through, and they don't tend to present challenges. However, when we're in circumstances such as this, when we're looking to check data sets against the other, or levels of activity one against the other, it's where those nuances actually come forward, and we sort of see those inconsistencies sometimes somewhat clearer, and that's what I understand the hate crimes database was one tool by which, through National Cabinet, that was addressed or sought to be addressed, so it will certainly improve that national picture. But with respect to our legislation and our powers, there aren't any active areas that I could suggest we would be putting before you today. And we work, but as I said, we work constantly with respect to our policy partners in Department of Home Affairs and with government to try and make sure we have everything tuned to the best effect.
Yeah, great, thank you. And from the Home Affairs Department, any change that you'd like to see to your legislation?
So I think to touch on firstly the National Hate Crimes database. So the first phase of that database was launched in December 2025. It doesn't yet break down by the type of motivation behind the hate crime. So it's a good first step, but I think we'd say it remains a work in progress to improve the level of data, the quality of data and the detail that goes into the hate crime database, which would then allow further granularity of the types of crimes and the motivations that are affecting First Nations communities. It relies obviously on reporting from states and territories to populate that database. So we are still working to improve that database, the data that goes into it, and I think over time there will be, it will tell a much more useful picture about the hate crimes targeted at Indigenous communities specifically, which is a level of detail it doesn't yet tell.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bean. I've got a number of questions about yourselves as employers, and you might not be able to answer these questions because you might not have the right people here. So I appreciate you might need to take a number of these on notice to be able to provide to the committee. And I know, Dr. Walsh, you've answered this question, but I wanted to know what proportion of the workforce identifies as First Nations, and at what levels in your organisation they are at. And if you can answer these questions now, that would be helpful. What internal reporting mechanisms exist for First Nations staff at AFP and Home Affairs who experience racism at work?
So I might start and then I'll pass to our National Manager People, who we did bring, anticipating that it'll be an area that we would have an opportunity to discuss. But yes, as I mentioned, the top line figure with respect to our current levels of staffing within the organisation is 2.7% of our overall staff identify as First Nations people. I'll pass to Brooke now to go into some further detail around the levels, but also perhaps between Brooke and I, we can provide some additional information.
I might take the levels on notice.
Okay.
And if you can talk about the internal reporting mechanism, so that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair, for the question. So a multitude of avenues that we have. We have our formal, which is probably our most prominent, with regards to raising complaints through our professional standards and our workplace issues and complaints resolution. To a broader range of supports and mechanisms for people where they have complaints or grievances they may want to manage, or just are not prepared to go down a formal reporting pathway. I think it's important as well that a part of this is put in the hands of the complainant as well for something they're comfortable with. We have our safe reporting, confident and safe reporting network as well, where individuals can have a confidential a conversation, discussion and seek support and help. We have our welfare officer network. We have, of course, their own leadership that they can speak to as well. So there's a range of mechanisms and supports for not only reporting in a formal but also in an informal sense, and also seeking some of those supports as well, that's most suitable for the individuals. So there's a choice there for them.
And so these are the options available to staff, both uniform and non-uniform. Is that how you kind of describe it in your organisation?
Our entire
One
workforce.
AFP.
One AFP, okay,
One
all right.
AFP, yes.
Out of date with the language. Thank you.
And sorry, Chair, can I just add also, importantly, I guess, and somewhat proudly, we have our Mullugung Indigenous Officers Network. So that's been part of the organisation for over 30 years. So it's up to members if they, what role they wish to play, if any, in that network. But within the organisation, that's a really great sort of peer support environment for First Nations members, where they can, commune together. We use them for, as I said, support to decision making and other sorts of more formal aspects. But it's also an aspect by which many things are raised informally that those of us in champion positions, such as myself or the organisation otherwise, can be made aware of and take some action on.
Yeah. And I don't know if you wanted to talk about your internal, maybe, for you guys it might be a bit different.
Look, I'll touch on broad awareness, but I would like to take on notice the level of detail about our internal mechanisms, because that's not, I think, me or Mr Goldie's area of greatest strength. But I would say we have a workforce across Home Affairs and the ABF of about 16,000 people working in really diverse settings, from policy functions in Canberra to operational functions administered by the Border Force, including operations that run in Northern Australia, in the Torres Strait. So we have a very... it is a big priority for us to create a workplace context that encourages the recruitment and retention of First Nations peoples. We do have formalised mechanisms by which workplace complaints or otherwise can be raised, but I think importantly, like the AFP said, the informal networks really matter. We have a First Nations champion who engages with staff around the country. We have initiatives in our regional office around yarning circles that have been led by First Nations employees. We also have initiatives that connect our senior leadership with First Nations representatives to develop a better cultural understanding, that connect First Nations staff with mentors, both of a First Nations background, but also who don't have that background, to ensure that mutual understanding. So it has been a big priority for us in recent years, and I'd like to provide a bit more detail on notice to do justice to the different mechanisms that we have.
Absolutely, and might be that. So I would like to know how many complaints of racism have been made internally in your organisations from staff, And maybe you can, and if you could do that by financial year and provide the last 5 financial years, that would be helpful. And including a breakdown of how each was resolved would be helpful. And maybe you can speak to this one now. When a complaint is made, what resolution options are available? And, you know, for example, does it include dismissal, or training, mediation? One of the things that we've consistently heard through this inquiry is not just that the reporting mechanisms are varied but fragmented, and often there is no visible consequences for the perpetrators of racism that people who are the victims of it can see. Yeah. So I'm interested to understand from your organisational perspective what...
Thank you, Chair. Look, again, we do have some current data with respect to complaints that involve an element of racial discrimination. It's not broken down such that it's specific to First Nations members or complainants, but since July 2025, there's been 3 complaints. That accounts for 2% of all complaints submitted during this period. They were submitted by an internal source and are undergoing investigation in our Professional Standards Command at a category we rate as a Category 3 complaint, which is a serious misconduct complaint. So I might just now pass the call to Brooke, who can explain some of those processes and go further to your question with respect to the seriousness with which they're followed up with.
Thank you, and thank you again for the question. I think, as Dr. Walsh has said, you know, in the formal sense, the number of matters that we have got there, our formal reporting process, and with regards to what we call our categories of conduct, matters with regards to failing to comply with AFP values and code of conduct, discriminatory conduct and bullying and harassment taken extremely serious and are in that Category 3. So there's a range of, if there is a finding of any of those matters, there are a range of sanctions and outcomes that may result. And as you would imagine, each matter needs to turn on its facts and its findings, but they do range from termination down to it could be counselling, it could be investing in, you know, a different role, a range of things in their coaching, more education, etc. But termination is potentially one of those with that Category 3 conduct. So they're definitely included as an outcome as a result. To your question about the outcomes of those, what we do with our professional standards, and whilst we're very conscious also as well of individuals' privacy, so as you can imagine, some of these matters are quite complex, but we do have a level of transparency with our professional standards colleagues that publish an integrity matters report, which lists at a high level some of the outcomes from investigations more broadly without going into specific details, but there is that transparency for the workforce as well.
Yeah. And is, in your processes, is the person who made the complaint of racism informed of any of the outcomes from that investigation?
Yes. Yes, generally, yes.
All right. Mr. Dowling? You might not be. I appreciate you might not be able to answer some of these.
Yeah, look, and I think we'll provide a lot more detail on notice, but I would say that the full range of options that you talked about would be available to us as an employer in the situation of a complaint about racism in the workplace, and that would include termination if there was breaches of the code of conduct and people's employment conditions. But there would also be a range of mechanisms that could go from counselling to education to training, depending on the nature of the complaint and the behaviour by the sort of perpetrator, I guess, in question, but we'll provide a bit more detail on what those mechanisms are.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Sorry, Chair, if I can just, just working back so I haven't misunderstood that question as well. Just with regards to those outcomes, when a complainant makes a complaint and that is finalised, there is a level of advice and engagement with that individual, but some of the actual sanctions may be included in part of that, but also very conscious too there could be some privacy considerations that would play into that as well. So whether it's specific to things like termination as an outcome, whilst it might be at a high level broadly from an integrity and a transparency internal, I might just take that just to confirm with our professional standards unit that is across all matters.
Yeah. And like the reason I asked that question is because we have heard the visibility of consequences for people's behaviour is an important matter for people when they're making complaints of racism, and there is a real lack of seeing the visible consequences. And that does go to the confidence then that people have in making complaints of racism and how they feel valued or a sense of belonging in any workplace, and particularly important workplaces like yours.
Yes.
So thank you for taking some of that on notice. I'm interested in. I think Mr. Dowling, you talked about in relation to the White Australia group. You talked about engaging in racial hatred. I'm wondering how you determine what engaging in racial hatred looks like.
So the legislation around the hate crimes that the White Australia Party was listed under was passed earlier this year, I think in January this year. So it's a relatively new piece of legislation. Currently, we have listed 2 groups under that legislation. I think is correct. That's right.
For engaging in racial hatred?
For engaging in racial hatred. That's the White Australia Party, and previously, before that, it was Hizbat Tahrir, engaging in Islamic extremist activities, including the promotion of racial hatred. So essentially, the legal test goes to the satisfaction of the Minister for Home Affairs on the advice of the security agencies, primarily ASIO and the Director General of Security, that group is engaging in the promotion of racial hatred, the promotion of violence against a group. So it goes to demonstrated behaviour of promotional activity of organisation around racial hatred. So it is a sort of a legal test that there is evidence that can be put to before the minister that demonstrates the promotion of racial hatred, that demonstrates the organisation of activities, the promotion of racial violence that would be considered in that listing. Is that anything you'd add?
I'd add to that the 5 key elements that were identified in particular in relation to White Australia and their engagement in that constituted hate crimes were the consistent promotion of racist and hateful propaganda about Indigenous Australians, Jewish people, Muslims, Asians and other migrant ethnicities to demean and incite hatred against these groups, engaging, so that's 1. 2, engaging in harmful conduct towards a people based on race or national or ethnic origins, and a particular citation there about when the White Australia members attacked a First Nations protest camp in Melbourne. 3, giving the Nazi salute in public forums and public protests. 4, displaying banners containing racial and ethnic slurs at public protests, again to publicly incite hatred against Jewish people, immigrants or refugees and non-white Australians. And 5, distributing propaganda to regional communities with immigrant populations, particularly stating Australia for the white man.
Thank you. Now, thinking about those 5 elements, I can think of a couple of social media pages that would probably meet that threshold of inciting and promoting hateful conduct and content towards Aboriginal people. Do social media pages can they be considered a hate group?
I think a social media page with that type of content would generally be referred to either e-safety for their powers of removal of content, or potentially to the AFP or state police if the content constituted hate speech. Whether if there was an organised group behind the social media page, then they would come into the frame for consideration of listing. But I think the way that that legislation is designed revolves around a kind of structured, organised group, which in some cases it would be.
Yeah.
In other cases it might not be. It might be an individual. So it would sort of depend on...
So what if you just looked at the moderators of the page and considered those the organising group?
I think it would turn, Chair, on... The function of the legislation in Part 5.3b of the Criminal Code requires the Director General of Security, so the head of ASIO, to be making a recommendation to the AFP Minister, the Minister for Home Affairs, with advice as to the specification of a hate group. So it really turns on the assessment of ASIO.
Yeah, but I suppose my question is asking about what's the information you use to make that assessment, because
That's right.
I think that there are a number of social media pages who have promoted hateful and racist content that incites hate and violence towards First Nations people. Potentially there is a case to be made that the moderators of that page constitute a group. They are in charge of it and the page and its content, and in lots of cases for those groups, the moderators are in fact in charge of approving content that goes onto their pages. And I think there are obviously pages that are more careful about what they do and how they do things, but certainly that you would, I think, consider a social media tile or a banner. What people put on social media in a square is worse than I think what you might see at a rally held up by some of these people. So I suppose I'm wondering what's the difference in people organising online as opposed to in person to constitute a group?
I mean, online behaviour, we do treat it in the same realm as offline behaviour. So use of those symbols in an online setting is there's prohibitions under that Act, but also under a number of state laws. For instance, people who are using the swastika and such symbols. I think with that type of content, the right lever in legislation would vary. I think it's a good and interesting suggestion for us to look at as to what the level of organisation around hosting a page, organising a page, identifying the networks that go behind that would constitute sort of listing under that legislation. I think we're very serious about the legislation. It is an evolving space. We all know that the online environment is not getting better in terms of the sense of impunity that people act with. The recent budget measure around the Counter-Terrorism Online Threat Centre will go to the federal government's capacity to investigate behaviour online that constitutes extremism and potentially terrorism. So I don't want to give you the sense that we think everything's working great and the online environment is under control. We're always up for considering how those groups organise. And as you kind of implied, they can be quite crafty about their behaviour online. So that's one that I think is probably worth us looking into a bit more and providing some more information to you about how this Act might apply to a sort of content moderators that are organised around pages.
Yeah, absolutely. I would appreciate any kind of thoughts or recommendations you might put to the committee relating to online groups, because it is a place where First Nations people experience a significant amount of harm. and there are relatively no consequences for it. Are there, and this is not necessarily specific to First Nations people, obviously this inquiry is, are there things that you think social media companies in particular, or kind of like online platforms, that they should be doing to keep people safe?
I think my AFP colleagues will have a view, as might Mr Goldie. I think we are constantly engaging with social media companies because we are not satisfied at their level of efforts to provide a safe space for online interactions. Australia, over several years now, has passed laws that require safety by design principles, basic online safety expectations, the digital duty of care that the Department of Communications is progressing will also go to these issues. If you go online today, even onto mainstream sites that all of us use, all our friends and families use, it is too easy to find extremist, racist, hateful content online. So do I think social media companies are doing enough to ensure their platforms are unwelcome to those types of content? No, absolutely not. I don't think they ever have. Do they have measures? Are they? Do they have content moderation? Yes, but I don't think anyone could be satisfied with the level of effort that social media platforms are taking to address this content, remove this content, because if we went online right now, we would have no trouble finding this content. So.
And we were asking the E-Safety Commission about this earlier. I'm going to come to you in a second, Senator Thorpe. We were asking the E-Safety Commission about this earlier. Do you see the recommender systems that are the social media platform algorithms and all that as a part of the problem in the increase in extremism and hateful inciting hate and a whole bunch of other things for us directed at First Nations people, and what do you see are the answers to respond to the harmful recommender systems?
Yeah, I think, and Mr Goldie has quite a lot of expertise on this area, so we'll add to that. I think the first thing I'd say is the platforms are designed to maximise engagement. They're designed to keep.
So they are? Did you say?
They are.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
And I think that inherently means that hateful content, abusive content, can be recommended, shared, made available to users because it maximises eyeballs on the screen. So I do think that recommender algorithms, when we look at since the advent of social media, have always played a role in maximising engagement, and unfortunately in doing so have promoted, made available extremist, hateful, racist content. But let me get Mr.
And
Goldie to
monetising
talk.
it, essentially. Monetising it.
So recommender systems, algorithms, they can be used sometimes for good. They can promote authoritative content, news in a crisis, and can also de-rank things which are not well engaged with, not well sourced and backed up. Unfortunately, as Mr. Dowling said, platforms are also there with a profit motive, and recommender systems absolutely are designed to keep people engaged for as long as possible. There has always been a content problem with the internet. You could always find racist, violent extremist material online. That problem persists today despite community standards, what Facebook, Meta's platforms, YouTube, all the major platforms and minor ones as well, would have in their community safety guidelines saying it's not available. In addition to the content though, where we really want to get to with the big online platforms in particular is looking at behaviour. Behaviour is the next way, where they collect a lot of signals about how people engage with their platforms that we can utilise to better identify people who are engaging in conduct and activity on their platforms and then direct them from that online environment into offline support services. The best way to be able to break the kind of cycles of perpetration of hate online is to be able to get people into the support services that we offer. We have some partnerships with some tech platforms to do exactly that, to be able to identify people who need help and provide them with help. But it is definitely a growing field and something that we're very much invested in looking into.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Senator Thorpe.
Sorry, Senator, I was just going to follow up just on that last
Yep.
point. One of the big concerns obviously is with youth, and they're curious online. And where you've got these algorithms that are targeting youth, and that's what they are sometimes. They're just curiously looking up terms, but it's being pushed towards them, and that all of a sudden makes them very vulnerable. And they're doing this often without any guardianship or parental control. They're just doing it because, and they're quite young. And as I mentioned about the age of some of the people that we're investigating, they're disproportionately represented.
Thank you. Senator Thorpe.
Thank you. They are young. I had a neo-Nazi come to an event with a machete. He was in year 12. And all he got was his parents got spoken to. So it's questionable. But anyhow, just back to camp sovereignty. Was the incident ever assessed against any Commonwealth terror provisions, or was it treated solely as a state-level assault matter from the outset? Did VicPol refer the matter to the AFP or Commonwealth DPP for investigation or advice about Commonwealth terror offences? And terrorism under the Criminal Code being a violent act to intimidate a section of the public for an ideological cause, was this looked at? Just want to know how carefully the police looked at this. And I know I've had my own meetings with VicPol and AFP, but these answers still remain, questions still remain unanswered.
And Senator, I'll refer back to some of the returns on the questions on notice, but all matters are certainly assessed on the evidence which is available against the different elements of the offence. So in this regard, when that investigation was in Victorian-led investigation, it was their first response, as it would be in the normal course of events across all jurisdictions. And based on the evidence which was available, that was considered the most appropriate, and Victoria led that. Now, the AFP have always been, through our joint arrangements, but throughout this and through the strength of the relationship, have been prepared to provide any assistance to Victoria Police that they may seek, but that hasn't been the case.
So they haven't sought?
They haven't sought that sort of direct information or direct assistance in relation to the charging and the like. But there's been considerations, as I say, if it reached certain thresholds and we were able to achieve the elements of the offence, then that would certainly be considered.
Thank you. So if a gathering of Jewish people or another minority group historically targeted by Nazis was attacked in the same way by a known neo-Nazi group, what do you think the police response would have been? And is it likely that they would also determine that hate crime charges aren't justified?
Again, it's not the matter of the hate crimes charges not being justified. It's a matter that they are more in the urging or the threat of force of physical violence, or whereas this has actually occurred. They've assaulted individuals. They've been involved in damaging locations. So the offences have occurred. That's why it's most appropriate for those offences to be, as I say, for assault and the like.
So it's better to go on a neo-Nazi group. It's better to go and actually assault people, cause harm, be dealt with by VicPol, than post online through Telegram, or whatever they use. It's better for the Nazis to actually commit the violence than to threaten to do it.
No, I don't I wouldn't support the representation in relation to that.
Just trying to understand it.
What I'm saying is that if it's done online, and it's a threat and it's a urging for physical violence, then and we're aware of it, then we would look to, because what we don't want to do is the offence to be committed. We're not going to wait for that violence to occur if we're aware of it. So in this regard, if you had against a First Nations group or against any other group or any other community which is a targeted group under the legislation, our focus is to make sure that the offence doesn't occur. So if we're aware of it, we would address that and look at the evidence which is available against the elements of the offence, and if they meet them, that's what the charges would be. But in this regard, the actual offences themselves of assault were carried out by those individuals, and therefore the charges were most appropriate because it had gone past just the threats. It had gone past the urging for that. It actually had occurred.
Do you think it downplays the racial motivation, though? We don't have an acknowledgement of racism when this is the process. Like, no one acknowledged that this is a racially motivated attack on my people. It's just that these neo-Nazis committed a crime of assault.
I think, as I said, those charges are very serious. They carry, I think, somewhere between 7 and 15 years, some of those charges. So, and a significant number of individuals charged. There were 15. A really thorough investigation in difficult circumstances, and I would say, again, the offences that have been applied are the ones that are considered most applicable under the legislation. Actually, I need to say that's from a Victorian perspective. I'm not the investigating member, so that would be where I am if the same situation was. I'm looking for the most applicable charge.
Okay. Sorry? Yep. So, how do community expectations have a bearing on these decisions? And does the AFP accept that racial bias, either conscious or unconscious, can influence investigations and charging decisions?
No, I don't agree that that's the situation. But from a community confidence perspective, I think the most important thing is that where we can prevent crime, we should. And in a situation, certainly online, if we want to make sure that people who are hiding in corners of the internet are exposed and held account for their behaviour. And in situations like this, the last thing we want is those offences that are quite traumatic for people. We don't want them to occur. So we will look to try and disrupt and prevent them as much as we can. That's the focus for any policing. Prevention's far better than the outcomes that often come. So that's not what we're looking for. We will work with the legislation that we've got. We will work with the resources that we've got to be able to do and intercept and disrupt activity wherever we can. In terms of, we do look for community confidence. We do hope that the sort of action that's been taken, and again, I'm talking for Victoria here, but it's not my position to do that, but from an AFP perspective, the community confidence comes from our capacity to disrupt crime so people don't experience the trauma that comes through. That's our focus. So as much as we can, the confidence will come from how we go about it, how we disrupt it, how successful we are in that regard.
Thank you. Have you ever made a finding against any of your officers for racial profiling?
I'd have to take that on notice, Senator, but not to my knowledge, no. But we'll take it on notice and confirm in detail.
Do you acknowledge that it happens?
I don't see the term referenced with respect to the sorts of code of conduct or integrity matters that we've described and how those matters are considered by us formally and followed through investigations and the like. So I'm not aware of it coming up in that context, and so I guess in that sense I don't see it as a formal thing that we have a concern or have concerns raised about our actions in that regard. But we'll take on notice your question because it does go to some detail with respect to complaints that we don't have available here today.
I mean, I've been assaulted twice under AFP protection with the AFP there. And that, I believe, was a result of racial profiling, where AFP police were not looking at me, they were racially profiling the protesters at the rally.
I don't know what to say about that, Senator. I don't know about the incidents you speak of. I'm sorry, so...
I think that's it from me, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just one final question from me for both of you. Like you would both be involved in work on social cohesion. What are some of the common? So like we've got the kind of threshold of inciting, violence and like that. I think that's a pretty high threshold that you have to meet for it to be considered a criminal offence. What are some of the common things that you see in people's and attitudes and behaviour in the lead up to an offence being committed? So I suppose I'm wondering kind of what are those common things, and then where are the opportunities to do better? I know that we tried to pass some laws through the Parliament that kind of meant that we were able to lower that threshold a little bit for how these things are looked at, and unfortunately the Greens couldn't get across the line on that. It's a missed opportunity from this Parliament, I think, to look after people. So I'm wondering what are the kind of common things that you see in people before they meet that threshold, because there's surely lots of indicators that you see in people, in groups, before they get to the point of inciting violence.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think, as Mr. Goldie said before, it's an area that warrants better research. So I think we'll share some observations about the types of indicators we see, but it can be very variable, and particularly as we see younger men, younger boys in particular, engaging with more extremist content, potentially becoming more radicalised. It's a really tricky sort of field to understand. What does it take from someone to go from non-violent views to see violent extremism as a legitimate, acceptable sort of activity. So I think it's worth sharing some of our observations of the types of journeys that we see.
One of the real challenges we have now, Chair, is that the pathway from somebody who is radicalised to mobilising to violence has shortened considerably. And this is something that the Director General of Security reflected on just this week as well. So there's a much smaller timeline, if you like, to be able to see those kinds of the final steps. So what we tend to focus on is things earlier in the sort of stages of radicalisation. The leading cause of people who get reported through to our countering violent extremism programs for youth is concerning online behaviour. So that's where they've been engaging with people online, they've been saying things on social media, and it's been noticed by one of their peers, by a parent, caregiver, their school, or indeed our police partners in states and territories in particular. That changes a little bit with the full cohort, so when you're talking about adults as well, and it tends to be more things that people are saying to each other. And reinforcing that this is very individual, so it changes a lot from person to person. There's things like associations. So who is the person talking to? What are they saying? Are they looking at particularly violent extremist content? Have they withdrawn and are socially isolated? Have there been noticeable changes in their behaviour or demeanour? There is also a real factor of their societal supports being diminished or degraded. So somebody losing their job can be just as much of a motivator from extremism to violent extremism, and then on to mobilisation, as their engagement with an extreme ideology. So there's a lot there, and while that presents a really complicated picture for us to engage with, it also provides a lot of opportunities for the really proficient state and territory practitioners in CVE programs in our police forces and schools, and everybody who's looking out for this behaviour, to be able to engage, improve somebody's situations, correct some of those indicators, and get people back onto a normal life path and be a healthy member of society.
Senator, part of that too is making sure that those reporting pathways, there's confidence coming from community. So, as Mr. Goldie said, you've got educators and the like who are directly engaged with individuals. They need to feel the confidence to be able to come forward to agencies without feeling like someone's going to go into the system, and that there's opportunities to be able to work with people. So it's not, and that includes parents and the like, that sometimes can be confronted by the fact that if I do the reporting, there's only one way that this will go. That's not the case. That there's opportunities for us to engage across the board and ensure the services are available for people. And that's particularly important where you're building trust with communities. You need to have those pathways. And if they're not directly with the individual, we need to make sure that there's other ways that people can feel confident to come forward to us.
And on the, and this will be my final question before we break for afternoon tea, how harmful can terms like monoculturalism be to, I suppose, promoting really kind of dangerous ideologies about who we are as a country and inciting kind of disunity across the country in terms of difference? And yeah, I suppose the kind of responsibility that we have as leaders or whatever it is. I suppose I'm wondering kind of how the stuff that we say in here might actually impact that young person on social media, then kind of going down this rabbit hole, this dark black hole of ending up in your sites.
I think language matters. We know that. We know the permissive legitimisation of language, prejudicial views, hateful views can normalise that type of behaviour. And these, I think, while it is very varied from different individuals, these are kind of recursive cycles, right? So if you're in a setting at which it is okay to engage in kind of hateful speech, then that validates, legitimises and potentially takes you further down a pathway that, for some people, those types of extremist views never tip into violent extremist views. But I think when you, if that type of expression and thinking is legitimised, when it's hateful, when it's racist, and that creates an environment where these problems can become worse. I think from the sort of victim or the person who's hearing kind of hateful speech, obviously that degrades their sense of safety and security as well. So I don't think any of us would want to comment on sort of particular language or terms that are used in a political sense, but I think it's clear that for social cohesion in Australia, language matters. The language used by political leaders matters and does have an effect.
So what I understand from what you're saying, like that type of language might not necessarily lead to, not all of that language leads to kind of violent and extremist conduct, but in lots of the instances where it happens, that's where it starts.
I think, yeah, it starts somewhere. Yeah, exactly.
The Director General mentioned on Wednesday, Senator, in his speech, he said things along the lines, we've got the right to protest, we just should consider how we protest. We've got the right to use terms or narratives, we should just consider how they're actually picked up by people and used to legitimise, some of their behaviours.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
I think I'd just like to add finally too, Chair, on this, listening to the remarks, it seems very familiar to when we discuss the issues from the policy and the prevention and the countering violent extremism perspective, and how quickly those issues, as AC Crozier has said, can transition into an operational sense. And I do also believe going to those sorts of online parts of the conversation and the role of social media entities and other providers or content environments, it does speak to that whole of society responsibility, and it goes to your final question as well. I think that social cohesion is under extreme strain, and as we've said, I think everyone needs to be mindful of the way in which they conduct themselves. And I guess from our perspective, we just try to make sure that we're consistent and clear and transparent with the actions that we take, so that people can be confident in what we're doing, and it builds trust in our institutions, so that we can do what we can do to keep them safe against those sorts of threats and contexts.
Thank you. That concludes our questions for today. You have taken some questions on notice, and we have a date of 17 July for those questions to be in to the Secretariat by, please. And if there's any additional information you think will be useful for the committee in our deliberations, that will be. I invite you to provide those to the committee. As is usual, you'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. Thank you very much. We will now suspend until 3:40 for afternoon tea.
Thank you.
We will now resume, and I call on representatives from the Department of Health, Disability and Ageing, Services Australia and the Department of Education, including the Australian Tertiary Education Commission, to give evidence. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appeared before the committee? And I might start down this end and work this way.
Tom Kelmer, and I'm the Acting First Nations Commissioner with the Australian Tertiary Education Commission.
Chris Mudford, Assistant Secretary, First Nations and Closing the Gap Branch, Department of Education.
Annette Knell, Acting Assistant Secretary, Help and Student Experience Branch, Department of Education.
Madonna Morton, First Assistant Secretary, Programs and Student Experience Division of the Higher Education Research and International Group in the Department of Education.
It's a long title.
It is.
And hi, it's Gavin Matthews, First Assistant Secretary of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Division in the Department of Health, Disability and Ageing.
Chantal Jackson, I'm the Acting First Assistant Secretary of the First Nations Health Division in the Department of Health, Disability and Ageing.
Good afternoon, I'm Robin Shannon, Deputy CEO, Program Design Group in Services Australia.
Hello, I'm Kathy Toes, General Manager and also representing Program Design Services Australia.
Thank you.
There's a couple of more witnesses. I want us to give their names in case they jump in.
Okay. Maybe we'll do it as you come forward, if that's okay, just because there aren't enough seats at the table. So apologies about that. Would any of you like to make an opening statement, Professor?
No.
Excellent. We'll proceed directly to questions, and I'll begin with the Deputy Chair, Mr. Benning.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, to Services Australia. How is Services Australia ensuring digital service delivery does not disadvantage Aboriginal and Torres Islander people with limited access or indeed low digital literacy?
I might just start with a general response, and then if further details are required, I can confer with my colleagues. The agency takes an approach where vulnerable customers who experience barriers to engage with our services online, particularly those who are not living in remote areas, not living in metropolitan areas, can be supported by our remote servicing teams who visit remote communities, as well as our agents and access points. And we also have a network of Indigenous service officers and other specialists who can assist customers to engage with the agency online and to use those access points to access the technology they need. We don't, of course, rely on digital channels alone. We have an intentional service design approach which is multi-channel. It's place-based, and that ensures that people with limited internet access or low digital literacy are not excluded.
Thank you. And what measurable improvements have resulted from your Reconciliation Action Plan and Closing the Gap initiatives? And what evidence demonstrates they have reduced racism or indeed improved trust?
Senator, I might just, we weren't quite sure of the line of questioning, so I might ask my colleague to come to the table on that point.
I enjoy the chairs that happen in these processes.
Yes, sorry.
Senators Danielle Regling, General Manager, Workforce Capability at Services Australia. Thank you. Senator, can I ask you to repeat the question? Sorry.
So, of course. So what measurable improvements have resulted from your RAP, your Reconciliation Action Plan and Closing the Gap initiatives? And what evidence demonstrates they have reduced racism or indeed improved trust?
Senator, I would say that our Reconciliation Action Plan and our Closing the Gap Action Plan are broad-ranging in terms of focus both on how we are designing and delivering services with First Nations people, including with our National Indigenous Coalition, or Consultative Committee, I should say, within the agency, as well as with external First Nations customers and groups, as well as both of those documents have a strong focus as well on how we are building cultural capability and safety within the organisation. I would say that we have a continued focus on how we're progressing to deliver on both of those plans, and we know that we still have some further work to do. I would say we don't have a clear measure around, are we addressing or reducing racism with First Nations people, but certainly we have a number of strong indicators that that work is being received positively.
Great, thank you. And sorry if I have to do musical chairs again, but there's obviously digital channels that you use to engage with First Nations individuals, but there's also the Indigenous service officers, and they play an important role in community engagement. The communities that I represent are very, very remote and isolated. Are there enough officers to meet demand, particularly in rural and remote Australia? And are there plans to extend the program or indeed deliver services in more digital ways?
Thanks for the question. Jodie Robinson, General Manager, Customer Service Delivery Group. So, as we were talking about, our approach to servicing is multi-channel, and particularly when we talk about customers that might experience the most barriers to accessing our services, including remote customers living in remote Australia, we extend that through community-based servicing as well, and we have a fairly extensive footprint. So, in terms of remote servicing, we provide remote servicing out to 335 remote locations, and that includes a range of face-to-face visits and virtual servicing as well. We have 27 remote servicing teams that undertake that work, and they will visit those communities generally multiple times a year through those in-person outreach visits. But also proactive outbound contact. So the teams have a look at what the servicing needs are in those communities. They're engaging through relationships that they've established in those local areas, for example, with elders and other community organisations, and then undertaking proactive outbound calls. You spoke about Indigenous service officers as well. So we do have a number of Indigenous service officers, and in fact, a whole range of outreach service officers. So currently we have 69 Indigenous service officers specifically in those roles, but they're complemented, as I said, by a whole range of outreach officers and social workers that provide services in community. To your question about is it enough, it's an active question that we're considering at the moment. We've been undertaking an extensive community engagement servicing redesign project, and part of that is looking, using the data to identify actually where we want to build and extend our outreach network, including our Indigenous service officers.
Great, thank you, Chair. I might just hand back to you for a second.
Excellent. Mr G.
Yeah, maybe to our education representatives. And the Department of Education, you've indicated that the government has invested in a suite of school-based anti-racism initiatives to prevent discrimination and strengthen social cohesion. How are those initiatives tracking, and are they effective?
Thank you, Senator. So there's a range of work underway, like you say, that goes broadly to discrimination. One of those pieces is around anti-bullying, and then other work around social cohesion. So if I start with the anti-bullying work, we had the anti-bullying rapid review last year that was undertaken, that was considered by education ministers, and the recommendations from that report were accepted. An implementation plan in response to that was agreed by education ministers earlier this year, and outlines a range of responses to bullying, with racism being one form of the discrimination and bullying that happens there. So that work is in flight and underway. There is also work in social cohesion. There were a number of initiatives in the submission, including Together for Humanity and Click Against Hate, which both initiatives the government has supported that provide resources to respond to discrimination and racism. Some of those are all forms of racism. There are also resources that are available for schools to respond to the racism experienced by First Nations people. So I don't have information with me on the uptake of those resources, but I know that there are a range of resources that are available for schools there. And then in terms of some of the First Nation specific supports, we do have the Indigenous Cultural Responsiveness Initiative that the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership has been commissioned to undertake. It's in the third phase of that work, which commenced with a broad consultation piece to understand the cultural responsiveness needs within the Australian teaching workforce. It then developed a toolkit which includes a cultural responsiveness continuum, and the impact of racism and racist beliefs and self-reflection are a key part of that response. The current phase is looking to build on the targeted testing that was done in phase 2 with a range of schools. And then we've got the First Nations education policy is a piece of work that is in progress, developing that with a range of First Nations partners, and racism and the experiences that many First Nations communities have had has been a strong theme that's come through that.
And with the responsiveness initiative toolkit, you've got, what, 13,500 users of it.
Mm-hmm.
What's the feedback been from the users? Like, do they give you feedback on what they think of it?
Yeah, so last year, AITSL undertook a targeted trial with a number of schools and received feedback on the usefulness of that tool. I don't have specific reflections from that exercise with me, but I'm happy to take that on notice if that's of use. I know that the data that was gathered through that exercise, AITSL have been using to inform further refinements to the toolkit, to the online platform that's used, but also to inform the work in phase 3 that's currently underway about what further resources might be needed for teachers to complement the self-reflection that they do through the toolkit, but also to identify the range of cultural capability, cultural responsiveness development, professional learning resources that are available so that they can be more readily apparent or available for teachers to access.
Thank you. And just one on higher education and the Respect at Uni study. I'm just wondering what came out of the Respect at Uni study. I know it's dealt with in the submission, but has it brought some lasting change? And if so, what do you think? What do you think has come of it, and has it been positive?
So I can answer that for you. So the Respect at Uni piece of work was done by the Australian Human Rights Commission.
Yep.
You'll recall that it came from the Australian Universities Accord final report. Mm-hmm. And the reason that recommendation was made was because the Accord really recognised that First Nations people and their perspectives needed to be at the heart of the education system. And what they really wanted to understand was systemically how that was going within universities, and whether First Nations people were being given, both as student and staff, opportunities to participate if they chose to, and gain a tertiary education qualification. So the AHRC spent a fair bit of time doing that report. It does reveal some pretty damning statistics. So about, I think, 81% of First Nation respondents indicated they experienced racism, either directly or indirectly, and of that, 36.6% experienced direct interpersonal racism. So it really did shine a light on some of the issues that, to be fair, the university sector were already acknowledging that they needed to do more work on. So it was kind of a piece that really kind of crystallised what probably anecdotally universities were perhaps are cognizant of and turning their minds to. What has happened since with that has been a range of actions that universities and Universities Australia, which is the peak body themselves, have undertaken.
Yep.
And I can go through some of those if you're interested in that. But more importantly, what the government's response to that has been is to really look at how First Nations people are being supported through university. In particular, there's a key piece of work around the threshold standards, and I'll take a moment to explain why those are important. So the threshold standards are standards that the Tertiary Education Standards Quality Agency, as the regulator of universities, uses to assess and monitor how universities are going. They go to things like well-being, ensuring that there's no discrimination, and ensuring that students and staff are safe at university, but they don't yet go to the specific nature of racism. What the department has done in consultation with the sector is release a discussion paper around changing those threshold standards, which needs to be done by a higher education standards panel, which I think might now be a higher education standards committee. I can't remember if it's changed. And they have provided some advice to government around whether or not there should be a specific threshold standard around racism. That included consultation with the acting or maybe the interim First Nations Commissioner from ATEC. So that's a really key piece of work. So without that, TEXA is limited in its ability of how it can hold universities to account, in addition to the work that unis are already doing. And I've got some really great examples of what they are already doing to tackle this issue of racism. But certainly the Respect at Uni piece was a critical piece of work, deliberately commissioned by government to understand more about what had been happening and what the response needs to look like. I know I've talked a bit there, so please let me know if you would like me to go through anything further.
So Universities Australia, what did they do?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of things. I think they made a submission, if you just bear with me, to the committee where they talked about a number of things that they've done. So the first thing was they identified a range of principles to guide the university sector to prevent and respond to all forms of racism and hate. I can go through that. They've also endorsed a national statement of all universities, which set out minimum standards for the prevention and response to racism. They have a Universities Australia Indigenous Charter as well, which really kind of sets out priority actions around how universities can start to tackle racism. They've also got a range of ways in which they're sharing best practice in terms of, as I mentioned, some universities are doing some really great things, and they're thinking about how do they get that at the system level, how can they kind of scale that and learn from one another at the system level, rather than it just being an isolated kind of specific university response. So we know, for example, some universities are doing things like having treaty and truth-telling forums in particular. The University of Melbourne is very strong on that. There's also a range of responses around cultural load. So universities are very now mindful of how much of a cultural load they may put on First Nations students and staff to assist in developing that, which is a really, if I may say so, quite a sophisticated response to recognise that as an issue. There's a lot of work being done on curriculum reform and how we're embedding Indigenous knowledge, things like languages, cultural understanding within curriculum, so not just specific First Nations focused curriculum, but teaching courses. How do we include and think about First Nations knowledge within courses like that? Environmental studies, so really trying to embed it not just as a specific thing, but actually systemically embed it in how we think about that. There's also a lot of unis are doing anti-racism and cultural competency training, and they're doing that in a co-designed way. So one provider in particular we know does a really strong co-design module that actually works with their First Nations community to think about, have we designed the module and delivered it in the right way? So while the Respect at Uni sort of brought forth the issues, what we're seeing also outlined in that report were some really strong examples which are showing a lot of promise and which the AHRC themselves highlighted as things that should continue to happen. Of course, we know that change is best activated when it comes from a sector itself rather than necessarily imposed. It's sort of got to be a sweet spot between the top-down kind of bottom-up. So, but that key earlier point around the threshold standards will be a really key opportunity. There are also a couple of other things that government has done in previous budgets, again around the Accord. So they established the National Student Ombudsman, which is for the first time a place where any student at any university can take forward a complaint and ask for the Ombudsman to get involved and investigate that. The Ombudsman can also do systemic reviews. So if it's, for example, getting a lot of data around a particular provider or sets of providers, it can actually undertake a systemic investigation as opposed to an individual investigation. And the other key initiative that I would point to, well, it doesn't go specifically to racism, it does go towards the prevention and response to violence and hate, and that, of course, is the National Higher Education Code to prevent and respond to gender-based violence that came into effect on 1 January 2026. And it has a range of, well, it's got 7 standards, but it has a range of standards that actually ask providers in their planning to make sure that they are paying particular attention to cohorts that are disproportionately impacted by violence, and First Nations is specifically named as one of those, as are other cohorts like students with disability, LGBTQI as well. I might pause there, Senator. I'm conscious I've spoken.
No, that's fine. Thank you for that response.
Thank you, Mr. G. I've got a couple of questions about each of you as employers in the first instance, and I appreciate you might not have the right people here to respond to some of the questions that I have, so you might need to take some of them on notice. My first question is, what proportion of your workforce identifies as First Nations?
So for the... sorry, colleagues. I'll
you
go
might as well answer while you've got the mic. Yeah.
Tell me if you're really sick of me talking, please. So as at the 31st of March, there are a total of 55 staff who identify as First Nations across all levels of the APS. That includes up to SES Band 1, and that's out of a staff of about 1,835, so it's about 3%. My quick maths in my head tells me it's about that. So that's our First Nation employees by classification for the Department of Education.
Hi, so for the Department of Health, as at the 31st of March 2026, our proportion of staff that identifies Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander is 2.1. And I also have our proportion of SES staff that identifies Aboriginal.
I will get at what levels they are on notice.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Services Australia, at the 31st of May, our overall rate of Indigenous employees is 5.4%. That equates to just over 1,800 of our staff are First Nations or identify as First Nations.
Thank you. And maybe some of these questions can be on notice too. I'm interested in understanding what internal mechanisms exist for First Nation staff to report racism.
I'm happy to.
I'll pick up after you.
Okay. In terms of reporting racism, so we have our standard departmental complaints intake service. So that's sort of, if I can call it, like the primary or kind of foundational piece.
And is that the one that kind of exists across all?
Yes.
And then you've got some kind of tinkering that you might do around the edges to make it fit for
correct.
purpose.
And then we have, while it's not kind of an intake function, we also have our Deadly Crew network in the Department of Education. And they really exist to support First Nations employees promote cultural safety, probably do a bit of mentoring. So any First Nations person can probably go to that person as well if they don't feel confident or they don't understand how to. So
that's an informal.
I think it's.
There could First Nations Employee Network.
Yeah.
And so there's peer support that's through that. So the staff that Ms Morton identified across the levels participate in that Deadly Crew network, and it is a source for advice as well as the avenues.
So I suppose my question about it being formal or not formal is like, so if someone talks to another person about their experience of racism in the organisation, that then doesn't necessarily get captured. So there could be experiences that aren't necessarily captured because they've spoken to a colleague about it, but it's not been it's not been taken through a formal process.
That's correct. And certainly our APS staff census results, while it doesn't go to racism specifically, there is a question in there about discrimination. Have you experienced it? Did you experience it in your, which is consistent, I think, across all of the APS.
Which I find fascinating, that you wouldn't ask a question specifically about racism in a huge public service.
Yeah.
Anyway, I know you're not in charge of that thing in particular.
Thankfully. We also have First Nation champions as well across the department, which I'm pretty sure will be sort of standard for most of the organisations represented here. And we also have an Indigenous Business is Everyone's Business Committee, which is chaired by a Deputy Secretary, has a number of deputies, has a number of SES, has a number of the Deadly Crew network. And we also, perhaps most importantly, even though we don't yet have them in situ, Senator, but we have advertised, as I understand it, a human resources strategy and Indigenous liaison officer, whose specific role it is to liaise with. So the more formal arrangement, Deadly Crew, perhaps a bit more informal, champions, a bit more informal. This role is a formal role that's been advertised. Again, it's someone who will work within HR, within the department, who can work with our First Nations colleagues and support them in how they're going, which even though the job hasn't sort of started yet, and sorry, I'm not familiar with the position description, I imagine it would have some kind of role in being able to support people who are indicating they're experiencing some racism and what to do about that and how to treat that and to support them bring that forward. Mr Mudford, I don't know if you've got anything further to add. You might be a little bit more knowledgeable.
I'd just say briefly, it closed this week, so the position's currently vacant. We're recruiting, and that job round closed earlier this week. There were staff from the Deadly Crew leadership as well as the First Nations champions that were involved with People Branch in setting the parameters for that role. But it would be a contributor to the broader ecosystem of supports.
Yeah, and so just so I'm clear, so you've got like so if somebody had an experience of racism at Department of Education, one of the options available to them would be to talk to their peer network through the Deadly Crew. The other option is to speak to this incoming role potentially as a way to navigate what formal processes are. And then what do people do now?
So certainly now they would access Deadly Crew
So I want to understand what the formal process looks like.
I may have to take that on notice, Senator, only because I wouldn't want to give you incorrect information.
That's completely fine.
I'm not au fait with exactly how the process works.
So I'm trying to, because one of the strong themes that we've heard through the inquiry process is that reporting mechanisms are varied and fragmented, and which makes it really unclear. And from the sounds of it, it feels like the public service is not immune from this. And then the consequences for a racist incident in a workplace is not visible. And so in addition to what are the formal processes that are available to staff within Department of Education, and you could take this on at the Commission too if you like, what are the formal processes that are available? How many reports and complaints of racism have you had in your organisation over the last 5 financial years? And what have been the outcomes of each of those complaints? So what have been the resolutions to each of the complaints of racism that have been made in your department?
I will see what we can get you.
That's
if that's okay.
fine.
We may not be able to give you resolution. maybe in broad terms we might be able to, but there might be some sensitivities around.
You might not, because I am interested in kind of what levers are available to you, whether it's dismissal, whether it's mediation, whether it's training.
I think at that
and whether one of
level,
those things were activated. Like you don't. I don't need a kind of. Because I understand there's some kind of privacy.
Understood.
Respect that needs to be.
No, I think
given in these instances, but I suppose I'm trying to get a sense of how effective are your own internal processes in managing racism within your organisation.
Understand. We will certainly get you what we can get you.
You would expect the public service to be an employer of choice and are responsible for a whole bunch of things when we're thinking about the services that are outward facing to community. And if you don't have your own house in order, you're right to raise questions about how you can then take care of the community outside of your organisation.
Absolutely. And just two further quick points which are relevant. As part of our induction training, there's a specific program that goes to First Nations cultural training. So we're changing providers pretty soon. But that also will go to issues around how you identify racism and what you may need to do about that. What are your avenues to how you can bring that forward to the organisation? And then I think the Australian Public Service Commission has only just recently updated its own training modules through its APS Foundations platform as well. And I believe they've got, I think I'm right in saying their new models cover racism as well, including how you recognise it and how you respond to it. So there's sort of two other parts of the formal thing, but absolutely appreciate the point that you're making and would agree with it.
And Senator, if I just add briefly, so we do have a complaints policy, and like every department would, the department's just been through a process of communication within the department, but also to support our engagement externally of no wrong door approach to raising complaints, and so that contributes to the informal and formal mechanisms that we talked about. We'll get on notice for you the racism data to the responses. Obviously, all Australian public servants are bound by the APS values and the code of conduct, and so there are mechanisms through there in terms of code of conduct as well as performance management behaviours, but we'll check with our people branch about racism specific responses. And then just to round out in terms of wellbeing supports, obviously we talked about the peer support through the Deadly Crew. There's also supports like employee assistance programs that any employee can access with First Nations specific supports and elements to our provider, as most APS agencies would for First Nations employees to access culturally responsive supports.
And to also clarify, ATEC is part of the Department of Education, even though it's statutory established by legislation. It accesses the corporate services of the department.
Okay, so any complaints would come
correct.
Through. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you, Senator. I think that from our portfolio's perspective, it's quite similar, but just a few things that I will call out. So we have harassment contact officers that are available to support people in, when they experience discrimination, racism, harassment. We also have Indigenous liaison officers that are particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff to access support in going through formal mechanisms or for other matters as they choose. We similarly have a peer support network, National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Staff Network in the department, First Nations champions, and a number of the other access supports like EAP and those that my colleagues from Department of Education have mentioned.
Yeah, and then and in the same information, the same questions I've put to Department of Education about number of complaints, like those also apply to
and responses to those.
Yeah,
yes,
that's exactly right. I want to, because I think, definitely what we've heard is that even when people make complaints about racism, that very rarely is that resolved in a way that's satisfactory to the person that's been on the receiving end of racist conduct. So interested to know, like you've got the behaviour code of conduct, what happens when people breach those?
Yeah, we'll get that to you.
Thanks, Senator. Look, not dissimilar to my colleagues, Service Australia has a range of, we've got multiple channels that staff can report. What we're really focused on is ensuring that staff feel safe to report and how we build that trust that they can actually report. And so that's part of the reason that we have so many different channels. We've got a couple of additional channels than what some of the colleagues have talked about that really are focused on enabling people to speak up when they're possibly not even sure about what they're seeing, observing or experiencing, because we're also very conscious that, you know, it's as important that we are seeing bystanders speak up about what they may be observing in the workplace or out of the workplace. So we've got a report it page on our intranet, which is simply a button that anyone can push. It's quite easy to find. Report it, and it will give individuals a range of options to choose from. And doesn't matter what option they choose, it will flow through to someone who will then work with them to understand exactly what the experience is, give them advice about how they may want to formalise it and what other supports and that sort of thing are around. Obviously, they've got, workplace respect officers is another, workplace respect team, which is part of that team that responds to those things. We've got our harassment contact officers, our mental health first aid officers. We've got a range of safety and other incident reporting mechanisms, and I'll ask Ms Toes in a second to talk about our employee network and the strength of that in terms of supporting our staff. To your point, we recognise that the formal complaints is not telling the full story. And so part of what we have moved to is actually understanding through some deeper analysis what we're seeing in terms of discrimination. And so you mentioned we talked about the APS census questions being focused on discrimination, but then we've looked at how we can, analyse across a range of other data sources to really understand what might be driving that discrimination, how that's being experienced by our First Nations staff, and then are they actually reporting? And it's clear that we have underreporting issues, which goes, as I say, to our view that building trust in the reporting pathways is a key focus for us as we move forward.
And do you think there's a problem in calling it discrimination and not racism? In terms of the language you use to talk about the experience of people at work?
Yes,
yeah, I think...
Yeah. So I think for Services Australia, certainly we have been on this journey. And I think as part of our submission, we talked about the fact that we have been developing an action plan in response to racism, and our executive is just putting the final touches on a statement of commitment around anti-racism. Part of that is we recognise that we need to actually name it for what it is. And so I would hope that we would see some evolution, I guess, systemically in terms of how the APS is considering how we're collecting the evidence around this. Because it's very difficult, our own, like I said, we've done some deeper analysis of our workforce data and our census data to be able to give that sense that we believe we have an underreporting issue. But that's very hard when you can't actually ask the question, or we're not asking the question about what's your experience of racism.
Yeah. And just on the staff network piece.
Hi, Senator. So in terms of other activities which I think are incredibly valuable as well for staff, we have our National Indigenous Coalition, which is essentially a peak staff body where we have people come together from across the agency and provide their voice to have influence on a range of things from recruitment practices and retention, but also the design of our services as well. It's really designed to provide that voice for our staff. And we have a biannual yarning circle where the senior executive come together with the National Indigenous Coalition, and in that process we're actually exploring the concept of power is shared and how we actually go about that in our agency, which is a real important step for us. The other pieces we have, which are really important, obviously, we've got 4 Indigenous champions who are looking at all aspects of uplifting around support for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, but also we have the Indigenous Employee Network, which is where our staff come together in their locations or business areas as well, several times a year. And our Indigenous employee employment team also has a channel where complaints, issues, etc. from our staff across the nation can actually go directly and have those, issues addressed through different business areas, corporate areas, etc.
Particularly where we're seeing patterns and more systemic issues. Yeah.
Thank you. And now I might talk about some of the other work that you do rather than your internal focused. I think one of the things we hear a lot when we talk about Aboriginal affairs and outcomes and closing the gap, and any work we do in this space, that people want to see practical outcomes for mob. I'm wondering if you can talk to how racism affects those practical outcomes. How is racism getting in the way of getting those practical outcomes for our community on the ground? Sure.
So from a school's perspective, I mentioned briefly we've got First Nations education policy as a priority piece of work. We're working with 5 First Nations education partner organisations, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education Corporation, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Principals Association, SNAKE, National Voice for Our Children, the National Indigenous Youth Education Coalition, and the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium. I name all of them, 1, to honour the work that they've done with us, but 2, because they all undertook First Nations-led engagement in term 1 of this year around the country in varying ways, and racism was a very clear theme that came through strongly in all of their engagements, both through the reflections of the lived experience of those people who were consulted from an interpersonal and an institutional and systemic racism perspective, but also, unfortunately, in the experience that some of those organisations had in undertaking that consultation. So NIAC, for example, have a strong youth focus, strong social media presence, and they experienced significant amount of trolling on their posts, but also that it affected their online consultations. So through the development of the policy, and it is in draft, we're working through in partnership with states and territories with those partner organisations, and it will be considered by Education Ministers meeting. But in the draft currently, we explicitly name racism as a barrier and the need for proactive anti-racist responses in enabling that culturally safe, supportive environment that has been mentioned here today to ensure that First Nations learners are able to engage, succeed and thrive in education. So while we don't have data that's available to the Commonwealth Department from a schooling perspective, states and territories collect that in terms of racism, complaints, exclusion and the like. We've certainly heard loud and clear the experience and the importance of explicitly naming it, to your point from before.
Yeah. And so how does that impact, though, young learners, and how does that get in the way of our close the gap targets for education? Like when people experience racism at school, what happens?
Yeah. So
what's that experience like for that family or that child? That means that they, I suppose, fall short of what is available for every other child in our education system.
Yeah, I think it's simplest. It affects their sense of and feeling of belonging in that education setting, which then has an impact on their engagement with schooling, their attendance, their ability to be present, but also if learners, students are experiencing racism, whether they're feeling that from an institutional perspective or from bullying and discrimination from their peers, that affects affects their feeling of safety, and then their ability to be present and ready to engage in learning, and then that obviously has a flow-on impact to the learning outcomes that they experience, and then their ability to stay engaged into school, to attain a Year 12 qualification, and then to set themselves up to a successful post-school pathway, whether that's employment, vocational education and training, or tertiary education pathway.
I might just add to that, Senator. So we have, as part of our quality indicators for learning and teaching survey, it's a student experience survey, and I've got some information for you about how First Nations students compare with non-First Nations students, which tells a similar story. So even though the overall education experience from First Nations students to non-Indigenous students is quite similar, so it's 77.7% compared to 76.9%, but there's lower feelings of being free from discrimination, harm or hatred, and that is a little higher between First Nations people and non-First Nations people. There's a gap of about 5 percentage points. But I think perhaps one of the most telling, the largest, most persistent gap that we're seeing in that student experience survey data is the undergraduate peer engagement between First Nations and non-First Nations, and that sort of goes a little bit to that continuum of education where if you've disengaged because of a negative racism experience, that will follow you and that will influence
for your education.
Yeah, and that will influence then trust and how you want to or wish to engage with non-First Nations students. So we certainly see there's a difference of 6.9 percentage points between that, which is why in some of the accord reforms that the government has enacted, there is now much more choice for First Nations people wanting to go to tertiary education. So now it's fully demand driven. So any First Nations person can go to a university of their choice. That now includes medical degrees, and that wasn't the case previously. To be clear, it's not that they'll always get their first choice, but they will have a choice. They are guaranteed a place, which has not always been the case as well. So that demand driven has been important, but then there's also supplementary kind of programs. So the government's invested $44 million in outreach funding to try to get to people, all people who may have disengaged from the education system and not even thought that they could or want to continue in the education system. And certainly our Regional Education Commissioner, Fiona Nash, has been really strong on this, on the career and that keyword aspiration. What are we doing to ensure that everyone feels like they can and should want to get a higher degree qualification? The Accord set targets, so they set targets, I think, of 80% by 2050, that people would have a higher or a tertiary education qualification. They also set targets, I think, for Indigenous, for First Nations students as well. And that's driving some of the other responses like needs-based funding legislation the government just introduced yesterday morning, around needs-based funding, which is, again, trying to encourage more people from underrepresented groups, including First Nation students, to participate in higher education, because you can see the economic benefit it brings an individual. They earn more money. Their average earnings are much higher if you have a higher qualification. But if that, higher education qualification is not for you, there's the very strong in Australia vocational education training sector as well. So that's why we talk about tertiary. So that's vet and higher ed as well. So I think there are a number of things that we certainly know that academic achievement is one part of the story, but for a number of groups, including First Nations, it's not the whole story. That's also why the government introduced the Support for Students policy.
I suppose sorry, just to interrupt you, because I'm going to have to share the call in a second.
Yeah, sure.
I suppose one of the things I'm interested in is that, like, the government is doing a bunch of work to support First Nations people through their education journey, whether that's in the early years or in schools or in tertiary education. One of the things that we heard in Sydney is that the biggest source of racism experienced by First Nation students in schools is not from their peers, but it's actually from teachers.
Wow.
And that was like really interesting evidence that we received as a committee. And this was from the president of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Principals Association. And we also heard from the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Principals Association that across 2 years of consulting the First Nations education workforce, not one person had a satisfactory outcome of a racism complaint against a teacher. Do you think that's good enough? So where somebody has made a complaint of racism against a teacher, there's been no outcome?
So I think, Senator, that we would have a strong expectation that there is a strong and appropriate response to all forms of discrimination, particularly racism experience. The handling of those individual responses will be a matter for states and territories or school education systems. But from an Australian government's perspective, that yes, there would be an expectation that is responded and followed through to an appropriate conclusion. And so it is disappointing to hear that evidence that you've received through your hearings.
And what are the things that you think would need to change for complaints of racism against teachers to be dealt with accordingly? Like, what are the processes now? Are they state-based processes? Do you have any line of sight in terms of what, like, the number of complaints, or like, is that data captured at all?
So they are state-based processes. We don't have visibility at the Australian Government Department of Education of the reporting of those complaints. There is a mixed policy landscape across the country as far as whether it is an explicit anti-racism strategy, whether it's a broader discrimination or a complaint strategy with racism, either a named component or that being the general avenue for that to be handled through. The discussions through the First Nations education policy that I mentioned is draft and still working through, but does go to the importance of explicitly naming and the importance of explicit anti-racism strategies and avenues for that to be responded, and the importance of First Nations involvement in the design, the monitoring and the effectiveness of those strategies.
So is it a gap then that we know that when our kids experience racism at school, it affects their trajectory for life in terms of their success? And we've heard evidence that teachers can be a part of that experience for our kids, but you don't have any line of sight of the incidences of that occurring for them in their learning spaces. And you're responsible for closing the gap targets relating to education and educational outcomes, and then this is an experience for our kids. I'm just wondering why that data wouldn't be captured if racism is a factor for our kids.
Yeah, Senator, I suppose, and at the risk of triggering frustration around Commonwealth-state
no, I appreciate
relations.
The separation. Yeah.
So, obviously, states and territories have constitutional responsibility for the delivery of school education, and that includes the regulation and registration of schools in the non-government and the public school sector. So, and the other thing I'd say with that is that all governments are responsible for the targets and outcomes under the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. So for Year 12 attainment, there is a direct role for states and territories in responding to that and ensuring...
Don't get me wrong, I'm not happy with the states and territories in terms of their role in the Closing the Gap outcomes. I absolutely appreciate that. I suppose I'm interested in the data that we capture and how that influences the policy that we make as the federal government and federal agencies. Like those widgets matter because they inform funding, it informs policy, it informs a whole bunch of things that we actually do have the levers for. I appreciate that states have their own responsibilities. I'm not like, there are a bunch of things that states and territories do in education across a whole bunch of sectors that I think they need to pull their finger out. But there are things that we can do to actually better inform what it is that we do and the signals that we send from a federal government about what's our priorities too.
Yeah, I would say that the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement includes an explicit section on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that incorporates the priority reforms from the National Agreement on Closing the Gap as a shared responsibility for all governments in delivery of education. It also explicitly calls out cultural safety, and while that doesn't go to naming racism within that agreement, racism is obviously a large driver of whether First Nations people experience and determine that it is a culturally safe environment. And so that being called out in the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement as the National Schools Funding and Reform Agreement between Commonwealth and states and territories does reinforce that expectation that it is considered in the National Reform Agenda for schooling in Australia, and I suppose helps to affirm that states and territories in their delivery of education, their oversight of schools, that's a factor that should be considered in terms of the data. I think there's always room for better availability of data, but without knowing in depth each of the racism plans for each jurisdiction or the data that they capture, I wouldn't want to comment on whether that should all be shared and aggregated for the Commonwealth.
We could probably check for you, Senator, the report on government services, which of course reports data across the Commonwealth, Australian government and states and territories. I'm not sure if there's a specific thing that would go to that, but there certainly is systemic data collection around a range of things. We can certainly have a look at that for you. I don't recall there being something like that.
I would appreciate that.
Yeah,
and
we will
noting your disclaimer that there might not be anything that you can provide.
Yeah, thank you.
My final question before I then hand the call on, if we've got some time, we'll come back. Otherwise, my questions might need to be on notice. In Sydney, the committee heard evidence from Professor Lowe at the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority saying that founding documents explicitly prohibit Aboriginal knowledge from being taught as a standalone subject and that it must always serve another school subject. Is that correct?
So, Senator, the Australian curriculum is a three-dimensional curriculum. It includes key learning areas, general capabilities and cross-curriculum priorities. There's an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures cross-curriculum priority. The expectation for both the cross-curriculum priorities and the general capabilities is that they are incorporated into the teaching content within each of the learning areas. So
that sounds like a yes, Mr Mudford, that it can't be taught alone. It's got to be taught in line with health or, I don't know, what are the other things that are taught in education? Maths or English or whatever the subject is, it's got to be taught in line with those things rather than a standalone subject on its own.
I think it's more that there are 8 key learning areas that are the subjects that are taught, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures can be taught in any and all of those, and so there is avenues throughout any of those to teach whatever Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander curriculum content is deemed relevant and age appropriate for that year level. And so I think if you took a simplistic interpretation of the three-dimensional, then you might come to that that conclusion. But given any content that is taught in schools is done through those learning areas or those subjects, I think it doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah, I mean, so you could say that there's absolutely space, like across 8 curriculum, to do some dedicated First Nations content, but there isn't a standalone ninth thing that says that you can teach Aboriginal affairs in and of itself, or Aboriginal matters in and of itself in the curriculum.
Yes, I think you could say that.
Yeah.
But there's also been work from the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority to provide further explicit guidance for teachers on how to incorporate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander curriculum content. And so, for example, in science, there was work that was done to provide a large number of guides of how that content could be incorporated across any science learning.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, thank you, Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate, we've touched on this a little bit. I appreciate that incidents of racism can be subjective and not necessarily recorded. But how does the department measure the success or otherwise of cultural inclusion initiatives in schools and internal programs to reduce racism or other measures such as student wellbeing and educational achievements?
Thank you, Senator. So there's a range of student wellbeing initiatives that the department supports, from the Student Wellbeing Measure, the National Student Wellbeing Program, the Anti-Bullying Rapid Review and Implementation Response that I mentioned. I would have to take on notice the data that is collected through that in terms of what measurement. I suspect that there's no specific reporting of racism through those programs, and it's a broader wellbeing consideration, and I think that would go to a number of the inclusion or wellbeing activities that the department has, recognising that, as we've just talked about, states and territories and non-government school authorities have lead responsibility for supporting the delivery of school education, and therefore would have more visibility of data and appropriate measures for that.
Thank you. And I suppose more broadly to both departments, how do the departments measure success beyond expenditure levels, focusing instead on actual improvements in people's lives?
I've talked a lot, so I might let someone else talk for a little bit.
I'm happy to provide some reflections, but I might also share the love with my colleagues further down the table, at the risk of boring you senselessly on a Friday afternoon. As I've mentioned, we have the Student Experience Survey, and I've mentioned kind of a range of data. So in the higher education sector, we very much look at attainment data, we very much look at completion data, and participation data as well. So that's at the system level. But in a number of programs, specific programs that we run, so for example, the government's new Commonwealth PRAC payment that started on 1 July 2025, what we look at, we can dig quite granular into that data. So we know that between when the program started in July and December last year, there were about 1,200 First Nations students who received the Commonwealth PRAC payment, which is about 3.2% of the enrolments, and that we are certainly sort of starting to hear the impact that means. Anyone who is accessing the Commonwealth PRAC payment, who, if that was not available, may have otherwise dropped out of doing their practicum associated with that course. So we certainly are seeing local kind of improvements through that. Another program is our university study hubs, which basically allows any student from any university to go and study, do their essays or assignments or what have you at the 71 locations around Australia. And again, we're seeing about 8% of students supported by the hubs. So there's about 27,000 students who have been supported by the hubs. About 8% of those are First Nations students. And in particular, sort of just going to your point about how is that sort of making people's lives better, we have 3 hubs in the Northern Territory, and 2 of those particularly are focused on a kind of a First Nations specifically focused supporting First Nations students on country. So the Waigiba hub and the Gathalala hub in particular, they offer a bush uni model, and they work with particular tertiary institutions. One of them's Macquarie and the other one is with Charles Darwin, thank you, University. So again, that's kind of going to that participation element. So we are actually, instead of somebody thinking it's far too far for me to drive from where I live to get to Charles Darwin University in the Northern Territory, and it's much more convenient for me to go to Waigiba or Gathalala or any one of the Arnhem Land Progress Aboriginal Corporation hubs that's got 3 sites. So that's a really tangible way that we are seeing people participating. Another example we've got is the tertiary access payment, and that's a payment that goes to people who are high school graduates who are wanting to go to university in regional remote areas and need to relocate. And we're certainly seeing growth in that. 666, which is about 4.2%, which is a bit of an increase from what we've seen in the past, are accessing that payment. So that's telling us, it's telling us that some of the things that we are doing, we are seeing increased participation, and we are sometimes seeing an increased attainment and stronger completion behaviour. Does that put them on a par with non-First Nations students? No, not yet. But it's improvement that we're certainly seeing at that programmatic level. We are also seeing improvement, as I mentioned earlier to Senator Stewart, around the differences between First Nations and non-First Nations in terms of attainment and completion, but the biggest gap is between that peer kind of engagement. So I might hand over to lovely colleagues from other departments. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. There's a few things in the health system that are relevant, and I think maybe we'll try and provide some of it on notice so that we can give you the complete picture, including the health performance framework, which the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare collect data and release analyses on. Going to your question earlier, Senator Stewart, and relating to your question, Mr Venning, some of the practical impacts that we see as a result of racism within the health system relate to things like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people delaying treatment, not waiting to receive medical care, being discharged against medical advice, and other things like sentinel events and workforce representation. And one of the significant things that government's doing or has done to address that is establish a new schedule to the National Health Reform Agreement that is a First Nations specific schedule that will implement a range of reforms, but directly to respond to your question, it imposes a range of reporting obligations associated with the funding that is delivered through that addendum, which will improve the way that data is reported so that we're able to understand the impacts more directly. Specifically, it establishes independent monitoring. It imposes a range of governance requirements, establishes a set of reforms through the national bodies that support the implementation of the health reform agreement, including the Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare, the Institute of Health and Welfare, the Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority, and the National Health Funding Body. It also establishes specific racism complaints processes, mandatory reporting, and embeds Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led decision-making within the governance structures that support the implementation of that reform agreement.
Great. Thank you. And one last question for me. It involves suicide prevention, which is not entirely within the scope of the inquiry, but there is a crisis in remote Aboriginal communities, but also all remote communities in Australia. There is a clear lack of or there was an inequity in access to services from Commonwealth government sources. What is the department doing itself, or indeed advocating to government, to assist with the mental health crisis in our remote Indigenous communities?
Yeah, thanks, Senator. Look, I mean, there is a range of... So, I mean, there's probably, just to take a step back, I mean, there are a range from a mental health and suicide prevention point of view. There are obviously a range of services. I mean, there's obviously physical centres, and we do have a range of centres in rural and remote locations, not, everywhere. Like, I mean, and some things where we have, say, for example, Medicare mental health centres, of which we have about 55, and we'll build a network of about 90 of them. Around about 30% of those are in regional and remote locations. So there is a sort of growing network of services out there for that.
So my frustration on that is that they are in regional centres, they are not in remote locations.
Yeah.
So I'm talking about outreach programs that don't necessarily exist.
Yeah, and so we kind of balance basically sort of physical presence with digital, channels as well, as sort of is basically one way that we look at this. And there are jurisdictions like the Northern Territory where it's a little bit different to that, but basically we look to have, again, probably sort of in some ways it's a little bit similar to what Services Australia were talking about multi-channel. So we do have probably a range of physical services in some locations, but not all. Then we have a range of digital presences and things that can be done differently. So we have services like 13 Yarn, for example, that can be accessed pretty much anywhere digitally. It has, it's very First Nations specific service. We've probably been trying to expand, we are expanding that to, because their capacity was basically sort of, kind of almost getting beyond their capacity to service. So through Bruce's budget, we've provided some additional funding to 13 Yarn to expand that service, but also to bring in some different, probably the messaging we've got out of that service, and from having a look at evaluation work, that particularly in remote and other places, they're really keen to get a text-based service into that, because people sort of sometimes don't feel comfortable calling into that. So we're sort of looking to expand some of the service. So we're bringing that in under the 13 Yarn service as a kind of, a specific response to a specific problem that had been identified. And so part of it is about sort of expanding our offering over time through that. Then we have some other commitments in there. So under the, probably recent expansion of particularly for youth, where we have our Headspace centres. There's been effectively 2 of those now that will be targeted into remote communities. They'll be run from through the First Nations health sector, so they'll be run through the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health System, as opposed to running them through Headspace National. So it'll trial a different approach to putting services into remote to be, basically led from a First Nations delivery side of, point of view. So that'll trial a different approach and sort of hopefully set us on a different path of putting in specific services there. That probably sits on top of the broader work that our colleagues in the National Indigenous Australians Agency do under their SUB framework. And then there are probably some other things that we've brought in the last couple of years as well that have a kind of fairly strong focus on remote. And that's a program we have called Culture Care Connect, which runs through the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health System, sort of run through NACHO. That is basically a specific sort of, post-pension service, aftercare service, that, runs in conjunction with it. And that runs in about, around about 31 locations with a sort of high focus on sort of regional and remote into that, which is a very sort of specific service around, suicide prevention support, but works within that broader social and emotional wellbeing context. And then we also have a range of other things that are coming in under some recent commitments, where particularly in places like the Northern Territory, where we have these concepts of youth specialist care centres, and an expansion of Headspace, where we'll be doing a lot of work with the sector and the Northern Territory government, particularly from that outreach point of view, because they are very large. Some of those, particularly the youth specialist care centres, are a significant investment going in, and I think our early discussions with the sector and the Northern Territory government is around how do we get them to work from an outreach point into community. So we'll look to set some of the new initiatives up, probably different to how things have been a little bit in the past. And then there is the work on the new National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Agreement, which we're doing with the states and territories and sector and lived experience peaks to look at what else we can do from a mental health and suicide prevention point of view, where we're doing quite a lot of direct work with the Social and Emotional Wellbeing Policy Partnership, which is one of the key structures under the Closing the Gap initiative, to look at a concept of a First Nations mental health and suicide prevention schedule under that, which was basically something that the Productivity Commission, when they did a review of the existing agreement, highlighted needed to be considered. So we're working with the sector around that concept to see whether it is something they want to do, and if so, how and what that would be. So sort of a bit of a range of some forward-looking work that we're doing in partnership with First Nations leaders, mental health and suicide prevention leaders, and some existing initiatives that we're trying to do, expand what we've got and put an additional focus on First Nations, and particularly where that might go into remote, and that builds off of some existing work that we kind of have, which is really about sort of trying to kind of build our pathway of doing more over time.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Matthews. Just a final statement from me. Again, I think Headspaces and Medicare mental health clinics deliver a fantastic service, but in my experience, they are not reaching into these smaller communities.
Yep.
And I think there's a role there for the Commonwealth to do more outreach into these smaller remote communities.
Yeah, and I would say that, so we're conscious of that as well. And so under one of the commitments we've got is around a range of outreach. Under Headspace, there is a commitment to expand effectively the outreach of that. So we'll do about another 20 outreach locations, some which will be in regional and remote, which has got a bit of a, as we work through that. So there is a range of things happening to try and sort of, build that outreach. So, I mean, you can't have a physical presence in every community. So it's as I said, it's a range of kind of trying to put centres in the right place, and then how does outreach work, and then expand our sort of balance between services, outreach and digital really is probably the approach. Not perfect now. We're not trying to sort of say that, present a picture that everything is rosy now. We know there is a lot more work to be done on this.
Thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Might just ask Services Australia a question, given you haven't got one for a while. You're sitting there very patiently. I suppose going back to the question that I've asked the other departments, which is where do you see racism gets in the way of achieving our Closing the Gap outcomes? Because I think people can't see the connection between racism and poorer outcomes.
So, Senator, I think what I'd say is we're very conscious, given the nature of our role, we touch the lives of hundreds of thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Our focus is very much on trying to ensure they get the right payments and services, and that the experience they have of accessing those payments and services through the agency is culturally safe and respectful. So I guess the converse of that is that they don't have that experience, and they therefore don't engage with the agency when they most need help. So we see our responsibility is to identify and address barriers that may affect how people do access those payments and services. We do deliver our services on behalf of policy agencies, and so we're obviously doing that in accordance with the law, and we're working to do that in a respectful way. But some of the things that we do is we're really reviewing and trying to address issues as they arise around our service models and channels, our decision-making processes, to make sure that they are working as well for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as they are for other groups. And that goes for other culturally and linguistically diverse groups, and particularly vulnerable and disadvantaged people. And so, the sorts of things that we are looking at are, making sure that our processes around how people prove their identity, how they understand their obligations, how they can engage with us face-to-face using our telephony services and our digital services, how are decisions communicated to them, how can they seek a review, how can they make a complaint. So we're looking at the way all of those experiences are designed, and testing that they are culturally safe and appropriate. And I might ask Ms Toes to just give you, as a sort of a little example, some work that we did over the last couple of years to reform the Centre Pay program. That's obviously a program that's available to all Centrelink customers, but we know that many First Nations people rely on Centre Pay quite heavily to be able to manage a range of expenses, and so we did it's probably a good example of some of the considered work that we've done to really make sure that we are engaging with First Nations people, with businesses, First Nation businesses, and in communities, to make sure that those barriers are not in place that effectively reduce the access and the experience that First Nations customers have when they engage with us.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I think centre pay and the reforms and the approach we took really goes to the heart of where Services Australia sees something that is having unintended consequences on the ground, and then where we've taken steps to actually address those issues. So essentially with centre pay, it's designed as a regular bill paying service, but we'd heard complaints that this, the program had expanded and businesses other than regular bill paying services were now able to access centre pay. And we were consistently hearing, and particularly from people in remote communities as well, where they don't have as many options to purchase, of some behaviours happening where customers were being signed up without their full awareness to deductions, sort of forms of unregulated credit were happening. There weren't end dates, there were high deduction amounts occurring, and generally people just not being aware of where their money was going.
Yeah, effectively exploitative practices, taking something that was really designed to help people take some agency around how they manage their finances and pay their bills. So a lot of businesses were basically seeing this as an opportunity to sign people up in quite an open-ended way. And so...
what were the consequences for those people?
For the businesses?
No, for the businesses or the First Nations
people who were...
Yeah, so we this is where we've embarked on this reform journey, and we've actually updated our terms and conditions, our policy, put in a whole lot of safeguards aimed at protecting customers. So previously, under the previous terms and conditions, we had very little powers to take specific action against businesses, but now under the revised or the new policy, we can suspend those businesses, remove businesses who aren't meeting their obligations, etc. But I think the other key part of the reform is we've narrowed down the types of businesses or service reasons actually that are eligible for centre pay. So they're really more now targeted at the regular bill paying service, not sort of household goods or clothing or things like that, which we were finding higher instances of that kind of behaviour happening. So,
and of course those reforms, as Ms Toes can go to, involved quite an intensive consultation with in community, but also with First Nations representative bodies.
And I might get you to step through that process on notice.
Sure.
And I suppose I'm interested in not necessarily the process itself, but I'm interested in why it matters.
Yeah.
And what it does for people's experiences of racism and discrimination, how it counters that. Like, I suppose I'm interested in
yes,
in that part of it.
Very happy to provide that. I mean, I think what this process I've taken out of it, and the agency is, that deep listening to understand how our systems can,
be
impact
non-discriminatory.
And lead to exploitative behaviour, but also how the genuine partnership to design is really important as well, not just consult, but genuine partnership in design.
I think the centre pay example is also a good one in the sense that no one set out to create a discriminatory scheme. It was meant to be, a helpful tool for people, but the way it was deployed and used by some...
You'll find some bad faith actors in this.
That's right. So, that's right. So I guess that's why we raised it as an example, because when we saw it occur, we took a considered approach to the reform and make sure that we understood how we could actually anticipate close some of those loopholes and sharp practices and listen to the people who are directly affected by the policy.
Thanks. My final couple of questions before we finish up to Department of Health, and I am interested about mental health in particular. I'm a family therapist by trade. And you know, it's should be of no surprise to anybody that the experiences of racism for our mob have been on the rise, certainly pre-referendum, but was put on steroids during the referendum and post. How are you prepared, or how do you look at what are the, what are the things that you can see that are coming down the track that are going to be impacting First Nations people, and how do you respond to that in a way that's looking after our mobs' mental health? Like, I think, thinking about the rise in violent extremism and, white supremacy ideology, and increase of racism online and a whole bunch of spaces. I'm wondering what are the things that you've got to do a bit of a pulse check about what's happening in the community, and then how do you turn that into a policy response or a resources response to what it is that the community need?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, particularly when you look at it, I guess, as a forward, looking piece, and some of which, we know now, some of which you don't know, what you don't know, and sort of as events sort of happen.
I feel like we definitely could have predicted the referendum was going to lead to an
that
increase
one,
in
I think. And people did, obviously, because obviously there was some funding, put into the, around that time, put into mental health, if you remember.
The $10 million.
Because it was obviously acknowledged as a, it was going to be an issue, and then obviously through that journey there was also the funding to the ANU to, basically look at the data to see what the baseline was and what it did through drawing off of the Micah Wire study, which I'm assuming the committee probably has access to that. If not, we can provide the links to it, etc., which do obviously demonstrate that things like that had a fairly significant impact on First Nations people's mental health and wellbeing for that, and there's lots of indicators that went up over that period, some of which have sort of come down, but others not, that have impacted that.
So I suppose I'm interested too, one of my questions to the E-Safety Commission talked about the fact that 50% of our young people experience racism online.
Yeah, it's sort of, so, I guess that sort of forward question, when we know that that's an issue, and I guess so we know that's an issue, even in issues like, where you have instances like Bondi and obviously what happened in Western Australia around that. And so, we do obviously sort of now, we're more aware of that, particularly through some of those events, it is now more of a pattern than where there are natural disasters. There is, for most of them now, or issues and those sort of events that come up, it's fairly normal now to have effectively look at what's the First Nations question in that. So lots of the natural disasters that have happened have had fairly specific First Nations responses in them, either led by the jurisdictions through the disaster relief arrangements, or the Commonwealth has done some additional things. For the Bondi attack, probably wasn't really sort of widely known, but we did a range of things, obviously in and around Sydney, but based on, I guess, experience from the past, when we looked to kind of support organisations like Lifeline, etc., and because they were getting that we knew they were going to get a spike in what would be a general level of societal concern around it, we basically gave an uplift into 13 yarn, because we sort of figured, well, this, it will probably drive, it's a race-based sort of, it's a very highly contested thing, it will probably draw up other issues. So we actually increased the funding for 13 yarn as well, amongst that, to ensure that that happened before the incident that happened in WA. So we're a little bit more probably forward-leaning now, I think, in terms of looking at what these potential impacts would be. Others that are around, there is quite some discussion really about that, the broader context of as these sort of debates play out that have an impact on First Nations people. So that is probably something that's coming up in the context of the new national agreement development around that as well. So it is a known issue. We do it probably better, I think, for events and incidents. Then there's probably the longer term trends that come out, which really probably mean that, well, aside from the way that those incidents are sort of debated, I think there's probably some less we can do that from a mental health side from that, but it probably, I think the policy experience is that it probably puts more emphasis on what happens from that concept of social emotional well-being and culture, and how do we strengthen that, and how those services come together.
So I suppose I'm predicting that there will be a decline in people's sense of belonging and mental health and social emotional well-being with the rise of extremist right-wing parties.
Yep.
And I think that's particularly so in the upcoming election in Victoria. I know that you're a federal department. How do you plan for the impact in your area that is going to have on people's mental health? I mean, we've certainly heard evidence from individuals who have talked about feeling unsafe, having an incredibly detrimental impact on their mental health, their sense of safety and going out into the community. So I can see that coming. Can you see that coming, and how are you preparing for that?
Look, there are consensus. From a planning point of view, obviously that's probably where our relationship with our sort of sector partners of how we do things really is quite critical, because it's not, we have quite strong relationships with, probably I would say also from our Aboriginal community controlled health organisations, obviously, which are very strong on advocating those sorts of concerns. So we tend to work them very actively in terms of looking at what issues may come up. We have, from a mental health specific point of view, we have GARDUI, a range of other bodies that we talk to actively about, what is likely to be coming through and what may need to be done. We also we have quite an extent, we have, governance frameworks that sit with the jurisdictions around that as well. And really some of those things come down to a planning also about where, dare I sort of quote Mr Mudford, but, the Commonwealth-state relationships really come into that as well, because some parts is really about the Commonwealth, but some parts are also about where the jurisdictions fit in, given that they run substantial parts of the mental health landscape as well for that. So sometimes it'll be, an issue where the Commonwealth will need to respond, and some others it sort of comes down to jurisdictions.
Yeah, I appreciate that it's there is a relationship between federal and state and territory jurisdictions. I suppose what I'm concerned about is the human impact of it, and departments not being caught out with a lack of response to what is coming is my concern.
Yeah, I think we're aware. I mean, I would say we're probably aware that we need to be. It's an area where we would not say that we have mental health for First Nations people. Sort of, there are gaps in services. There is more need than we have as a baseline. So there is a fair focus on trying to actually lift what we're doing here over time.
And if I can also say that it's not just the unique experience of First Nations people, but if I can give a shout out to the culturally and racially marginalised brothers and sisters who are in the same boat right now, you need to be thinking about what this looks like for people on the ground.
And I mean, from a mental health point of view, I think from our colleagues we work with through Mental Health Australia that have released a report recently that sort of, I think, points out from a multicultural point of view, obviously for mental health has a significant impact from those kinds. So those are all known things, and we do have a range of supports that target various other parts of directly, because we have a range of mental health supports that work for LGBTQI+, and we have a range of services, a program of assistance to survivors of torture and trauma, for example, that works very specifically for new migrants that come from countries with that sort of background. That's probably a bit of an acknowledged. It's an amazing service that does great work with that community, because of the concern, the issues that come from when people come into that works really proactively to do that. And we do quite a lot of work with them to forecast likely demand. So that sort of tends to look at the migration program and then forecast, for example, where likely things are going to be, where are they settling in Australia, and then basically shuffles resources really to respond to where that pattern of demand is. So it's sort of a range of ways we do it, but I wouldn't pretend that it's all perfect either.
Thank you. And I'm conscious of the fact that, Professor, you haven't had a chance to respond to any questions today. I'm just wondering if there's anything you'd like to say before we finish up for the day.
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, it was mentioned earlier that the Department of Education do own the staff of ATEC. They're employees of the department. They work within ATEC, but I think, what's worth recognising is that within ATEC, under the structure of the 2 full-time commissioners, one is the First Nations Commissioner. Of the 3 branch heads, 2 are First Nations people, and 5% of our staffing are in fact First Nations staff. So we're taking on board what was recognised through the Higher Education Accord and developing the structure accordingly and the way that we're going about our business. One of the things that I think at a future meeting ATEC will be able to have a greater contribution, but we were only formally created on the 29th of April and we're just establishing, and the permanent commissioners only start on the 1st of July, so a couple of days' time, and I'll remain on potentially for a short time while the First Nations Commissioner will be able to be released and take up their role. I think the discussion's been very good here, but there's a few lessons I think that we need to look at. One of the ones you asked the question, or the question was asked about suicide prevention. I think one of the key issues has been something that we haven't been able to address. Racism does, and discrimination do play a role in it. I think the Department of Health gets the questions fielded to them, but we need to really look at it from a multi-agency perspective and address those other issues that impact on mental health and suicide, and they include things like overcrowded housing and access to employment, education on communities, the high levels of people incarcerated, and looking at measures. And I know that there's some discussions happening in this place to do that, but there's still more needs to be done there. With ATEC, we'll be establishing a First Nations advisory committee as well to guide all of ATEC and assist within our negotiations with the universities through the mission-based compacts, and we'll be able to pick up on quite a number of the issues, but not in this first instance. We've only got one mission-based compact and for 2027, and then we move into a longer-term one that we negotiate next year. But for them to be able to, universities to be able to advise about issues like racism and what they're doing about it in there. There's also under the Accord and the direction that we've provided to universities who have taken it on, that there needs to be a greater level of Indigenous governance in the university, across the university, and that's going to be, I think, a game changer. It's more than just an advisory role, but they'll actually have funding responsibilities or responsibilities over the funding of the for First Nations people. So there's quite a number of initiatives that are in play that will happen into the future, and of course by next year we'll start to move into the harmonisation between vocational education and higher education, which is going to again see a greater participation of First Nations people. But it was picked up earlier, until the feeder groups are addressed, and that's from the schooling all the way through to higher ed, we won't be able to achieve within the 2050 time frame of 80% of people. But I think measures like having demand-driven places, for First Nations people, so any First Nations person who wants to get into university, they won't be held back because there's no funding for them. It's there, it'll be there for them. My colleague Kyle, who's one of the First Nations branch heads, might want to add something.
Agree, Senator. Kyle Williams-Weigel, First Nations and Relationship Management Branch from the Australian Tertiary Education Commission. The Accord was highly instructive. It had First Nations written over 240 times across the 400 pages, and First Nations self-determination written 19 times. it's been the playbook for, as Professor Karma talked around, the establishment and formation of the ATEC, and not just symbolically but practically through, you talked earlier about the policy settings and the signals we're setting to the system. Our interim statement of strategic priorities talks to what you talked about earlier around Aboriginal Torres Strait knowledges and histories. We call out explicitly in our interim SSP under the First Nations domain the primacy of embedding Indigenous knowledges, of First Nations leadership, and the activation of the principle of self-determination. And this is us as the ATEC being very deliberate in ensuring that we send the signals of what matters to us and what matters to the system. You heard a lot of evidence in previous hearings, both in Sydney and Adelaide, about the primacy of self-determination. And for us, we take that very seriously around how that can be activated in the higher education space via the levers that we have available to us through the Australian Tertiary Education Commission.
Yeah. And Senator, if I could have one plea, and you asked the question earlier, what can be done, and that is for politicians to be more responsible in the information that they provide to the community. We've heard it just again in the last week where this notion of $33 billion is spent on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Where's this gone? Why is there no outcomes on it? That is leading to a lot of prejudice within the community, a lot of discrimination and a lot of racism, because Aboriginal people feel that when others come in and challenge them on that. And the facts are that $33 billion does not go to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Only about 18% or $6 billion comes under special measures funding for Indigenous specific projects. The rest are all citizenship entitlements that everybody is entitled to. So we need to make sure that politicians are honest and have the integrity to give the correct information out to the community, which will help to, I think, reduce some of the stresses that our people are feeling.
I don't disagree with you, Professor. I think every leader has a responsibility to make sure that the information they're providing to the community, to the Australian electorate, is factual, not based on alternative facts, because I agree. I've seen the increase in harm that occurs when that information that's communicated is not fact. Thank you very much for hanging over time. I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for your attendance here on a Friday afternoon. I think each of you have taken questions on notice. If you can please forward it to the Secretariat by the 17th of July. And as is usual, you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. That concludes today's proceeding. I want to thank witnesses throughout the day for their attendance. I want to thank Hansard and Broadcasting and the Secretariat for all their support throughout the day. I declare this hearing closed.
Thanks,